Today's episode is brought to you by elitefts.com. Founded in 1998 with the primary aim to live, learn, and pass on. Please help Elite FTS support this mission by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, and thinking of us for your training needs. If you can put it in a gym bag or load weights on it, Elite FTS has it.
What's going on? I'm Dave Tate. We are broadcasting from the middle of the Elite FTS weight room, where the underground still thrives and you're part of the crew. It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. What's going on, guys? We are back with another episode of Table Talk. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. What we're going to do is I have Tom and Naomi Sheppard on the podcast. I was going to take a note, write a note to say what podcast they were on before, but it is in the description. So I'm just going to say 63. 128. 128. See, I was way off. So all the background information, all that stuff, go listen to that. What I wanted to do with this podcast is just speak with them on some specific training methods. You have heard me talk about the training crew and the Table Talk support group, crew, whatever it's going to be. We're now getting close to the first benchmark. We're about 30 members away. And then after that, there's going to be a specific podcast just for crew members. Crew members already now are part of the Discord group, which has like 30 or something free ebooks. There's training discussions, AMAs, everything else that kind of goes on in Discord. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff on there. There's the form checks, all that stuff is already on there now. The podcasts that will be pushed to that are going to be more AMA related, more training related, that has more context. Because when you guys ask questions on the Instagram Q&A or the YouTube question callouts, the questions are broad. So if I have to answer them, or if Tom and Naomi, when we know that they do their things, have to answer them, it's a tricky thing because you don't have context. So you either have to answer it 3 or 4 different ways to try to make a broad stroke, or you get more context and then you can give a little bit deeper answer with that. That's kind of what the podcasts are going to be like that are going to push to the crew. So if you're not a member of the crew now, go to the description, click join the crew, sign up for that, and that will be part of what you'll be getting. So this is kind of like I don't want to say a dry run, a sample run, but it's prelude. I'm looking for, it's going to be a little bit different show because we're going to kind of deep dive into some of these different things that are associated with that. So again, join the crew. Now, as far as the sales at Elite FTS, they are a sponsor of the show, obviously. The clearance sales are going on now that I talked about in the last episode. The SS yoke bar is $100 off with free shipping, which probably is not going to ever happen again. The equipment is on a 10% discount, probably, I don't know, maybe another 7 days. Then the important thing with that is to understand in January the prices are going up. I don't have much saying that. You're a retailer, it gets passed on to me. That's just kind of what it is. So the discount is actually more than 10% if you take into account what it's going to go up to. I don't want to tell you guys that because you probably don't want to know. Nobody wants to know. And I think apparel is 30% off. Bands are 30% off. Wraps and straps are 40% off. Basically, it's a site-wide sale. Head over to elitefts.com. And there's that. So now, what we're going to talk about is training methods that are, it's interesting because when I threw this out to Tom and Naomi, it was pretty broad. Like I'm sitting here saying,
you can't get much more broad than that.
Yeah,
really.
I know. We need to talk about
how do you train?
Yeah. I was like, well, we need to talk about training methods. And like, well, what type of training methods? Well, the methods. And I think it was more along the lines of eccentric, just general broad stroke. But the interesting thing is everybody's going to classify methods a little bit differently. Yeah. Where I classify things as Circa-Maximal, submaximal, Supra-Maximal, and then lower down the chain. It's like explosive, maximal, Circa-Maximal, submaximal, then everything kind of falls into there. You broke yours down by eccentric, isometric, and contraction, which essentially is just another way to look at some of the same
absolutely.
things.
And all of them have subdivisions within that:
Yes.
Supra-Maximal, isometric methods, so on and so forth.
Yeah,
so,
which are where my notes are here as we talk about some of these things and how you implement them and why to implement them. You know, we'll kind of do a deep dive into those things. So I'll let you just start with the eccentric prelude intro.
Oh, okay. I guess, so with the eccentric training, we started doing that a lot more with our lifters, mainly because we wanted to help find a way of reducing injury risk and a way of getting them stronger without beating them up as much. So with the eccentric training, there's a lot of kind of benefits to it. And when we say eccentric methods, we're talking about methods that emphasize the eccentric part of the lift.
Which is the downward part.
Yeah.
Of the movement.
So the resist, I mean, pretty much every rep style is going to have an eccentric, an isometric, and a concentric component. But it's about which one are you emphasizing and which part of it are you working harder on proportionally.
Yes.
So we generally do the eccentric training first in the week as well when we program it, because it's the most stressful. And then also it's the one that if we're training athletes as opposed to powerlifters, it's the one that we will take out when athletes are in season.
Okay.
The reason for that is that the eccentric methods, when you exaggerate the eccentric, it's like a double-edged sword, because one of the best things about kind of exaggerating the eccentric is that you get more muscle damage, which is great from a hypertrophy point of view, because you get more mTOR activation, which starts signaling all those anabolic pathways. So actually, eccentric loading is more important in hypertrophy than concentric loading is. The downside of that is too much muscle damage is a bad thing if you can't recover from it. So you need to be careful with the loading, and that's probably what we saw, right? When you start coaching people with them, you chuck slow eccentrics in at them, and they're like, man, I'm sore as fuck. I couldn't do anything for like 2-3 days, right? But you just got to adapt to it and go from there. So it's a very powerful tool for that reason, but it's got a load of other benefits that were probably bigger reasons why we started implementing it, which is first off, tendon strengthening. So it's going to have a much greater effect on strengthening the tendons in the muscle as well as the micro tendons within the muscles. So you don't just have those big tendons that attach at the end. You've got a series of micro tendons that run through the muscle fibers and essentially network and connect them better. So if you strengthen those and actually create new ones, which eccentric loading will do, the muscle fiber is more rigid. The muscle is more rigid because the fibers are connecting better, which means you get a better force transfer through the entire muscle. Because it's not like you just have a muscle fiber that runs from this end to this end, right? It's lots of little ones, and then you got 1,000 of them or whatever. They all need to be connected somehow so they work in unison. And that's something that you get from eccentric training that you don't get from isometric or concentric training. Regardless of whether it's slow tempos or whatever you're doing, that's a big part of it, which obviously then comes with a decreased risk of injury and muscle tears and things like that. Especially because it also preferentially gives you hypertrophy at the distal end of the muscle belly. So at the end that's closest to the tendon, it thickens and strengthens the muscle close to the tendon. So not only is the tendon stronger, but its main attachment point to the muscle is better as well. That makes sense. You want to take over? I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
So that was a big part of it as well. And then when you start looking into like the studies behind eccentric training, you realize that actually you can get more strength gains from training eccentric only than you can from concentric only. So they have done studies where you get groups of people who do literally eccentric only training, so literally only lowering the bar, versus concentric only, where you basically only lift it and then you either drop it or basically show no control on the way down. And then you test them at the end. And the group who did eccentric training, they could probably because they could load it heavier, and there's a couple of other reasons, actually increase their one arm strength more, even though they weren't doing any concentric lifting. So that kind of illustrates how powerful as a tool is, right? And then, so realistically, we started looking at it as, if your eccentric and your concentric strength are both 100%, you're pretty much at your limit already. And you're going to have to get stronger at both immediately to get any better. Whereas if you have a 20 or 30% extra, say, in eccentric strength, that's essentially like your strength reserve. Okay? So that is the amount of load that your body is able to handle and feels safe, inverted commas, handling. So now you just got to build the force production and the concentric to do it. But you know that if you can lower, say, 120%, 4 or 5 second eccentric, you know that the Golgi tendon organs, which are essentially like the body's handbrake, which basically stop you producing too much force, they're okay with that amount of weight. And the tendons and all the soft tissue structures can handle that weight also. So now you just got to get your force production and the concentric up higher. And we found that if you get that gap, the concentric goes up quicker than if you're trying to get them both up at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. Like you've got that big gap to fill, and it's easier to fill that gap rather than trying to do both at the same time.
Yes.
So there was that, and then there's the fact that when you're trying to teach people how to lift, what's the first thing you usually get a beginner to do?
Well, the negative, you teach in reverse.
Yeah, and you teach them to slow the fuck down as well, right? Like if you can't do something fast, so can't do something slow, you don't do it fast.
Yes.
So from a motor control point of view, all our lifters started to clean up their technique when we started, even without us necessarily cueing them to do so. Okay.
Yeah.
So it gives you more opportunities also as a coach.
But what do you mean without cueing them to do so? Because if you're telling them to lower slower.
Yeah. So what I mean by that is when you have like 6 seconds or whatever to get to the bottom, if there's a deviation from the bar path or something that you want, the lifter has more time to feel it.
Yeah.
And they can be more proprioceptive, aware of it, than if they're rushing down to the bottom. That's what I mean by that. So they have a bigger chance to self-correct than if they're doing a fast eccentric. And then you have the matter that when they've looked at studies at like EMG studies and stuff on brain activity when people are lifting, during an eccentric action or contraction, you get considerably more activation in your motor cortex than you do during an isometric or a concentric. So there's more motor learning happening during the eccentric part of the lift than there is during the concentric.
How did they study that?
Honestly, I can't remember off the top of my head.
Well,
I get what you're saying.
Yeah, because that's the first thing that happens in most exercises. Like, is that true in the deadlift?
That would be a very good question.
You see what I'm saying? Because you take it out, it's like, oh shit.
Yeah.
Then there's that.
From what I remember, I just remember seeing like the graphics of the, so, they represent it on a graph, like a picture, like it's lit up.
Yeah.
And it's considerably more lit up during the eccentric than during the turnaround or during the concentric.
Yeah.
So what that kind of said to me was, okay, if more learning happens during the eccentric and then you spend more time in the eccentric, it's better to do that than more time on the concentric. First off, because there's more motor cortex activity, and also because we're stronger on the eccentric, going slower on the eccentric isn't going to mean that you need to sacrifice as much weight as if you get someone doing a slow concentric. So they can still get a meaningful amount of weight on the bar, as opposed to, you get someone doing a 5 second concentric, how much is everything going to drop down, right? And then just from like a motor control point of view as well, slow eccentrics are going to give you better activation, like all the antagonistic muscle groups as well. So, if they're a squat, like your hip flexors and your hamstrings, if you drop into the bottom of a squat, no one's going to feel anything going on there, right? Whereas if you start slowing things down, you learn how to keep them tight and rigid during that eccentric action. And that's actually why we use slow eccentrics as like a gateway to fast eccentrics later on. Because at the end of the day, a faster eccentric can mean a faster concentric. But if you're not ready to do a fast eccentric because you don't have the underlying structures and the motor control to do so, it can have the opposite effect, and you just end up either tightening up or the Golgi tendon organs actually sensitize more to stop you doing that because they don't feel like safe and ready for it, if you like. So that was why we started implementing the eccentric methods, I guess, with our lifters.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people use it anyway and just not really understanding why they're using it. They just know that it helps.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some people are using it without knowing that they're really, especially in the powerlifting strength realm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the stronger you get, the more you, let's say in a squat, you let the weight settle. Yeah. You're bracing, so you're basically isometrically holding in a way.
Yeah.
But you don't go until everything's tight.
Yeah.
No, exactly.
And then go, where if you just pick and go, obviously it's going to be a faster eccentric, where most people are going to spend that time getting tight.
Yeah.
And then going down, essentially creating a little bit slower eccentric, which has that carryover,
Yeah.
where some of the things they already do without, like I said, they already do without knowing they do.
Yeah.
And to understand what's happening helps,
Yeah,
especially when we
absolutely.
dig deeper into, you know, how to program some of the things that are in there. If you don't have a base understanding of why, then all of a sudden it's like, what the fuck? You can't do that shit. You're going to kill yourself.
Yeah.
You know, you got to understand where it's going from
we
there.
had a lot of stuff like that for a while. Like Naomi was doing overload eccentrics on her deadlift. So you block pull like an inch.
Yeah.
And then we'd pull the blocks away. And then she'd slowly, and people are like, oh my God, you're going to break your back. You can't do that. It's like, well, she's handling like 110%, whatever, but she spent like 6 months doing slow eccentrics at varying. Do you know what I mean? Like that's the end result of a 3 to 6 month training block.
Yeah, it's not something you just check
That
in.
peaks with something like that. But if you look at it without context, you're like, holy shit, I couldn't do that. Well, no, because you haven't done the groundwork to get there, right?
That was, you know, that type of, so reverse deadlift, right? So top down deadlift was the first thing that I thought of when I first saw the mono hooks that go in a rack.
Yeah.
Everybody else is like squat bench. I'm like, wait a fucking minute.
There you go.
Like now you don't have to take this stupid step back, or you don't have to worry about. You just set them low, pick, and go. You know, some of the, I think Vincenello, one of the old time great deadlifters, used to do the top down deadlifts, and it was always one of those things that's just a
It's really
very
hard. It's really hard to set up.
yeah. So now
if you
you
don't
got
have
now you got to pick it, and then you're holding it. And you're like, you guys get this
Get
box,
the boxes away.
get them out. You know.
The other way we've done it, which is precarious, but it works, is like you lift like 80% on the way up,
And then
and then you have a partner either side.
Put the plates on.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's great until you get one guy who's lazy and puts it on like 2 or 3 seconds later, and you're like, I've got 100, I got like 110 on this side and 90 on this side.
I mean, they do work though. Like
Yeah, they really
I've
do.
done those loads, but you have to have 2 people like really watching and putting them on at exactly the same time.
Yeah.
So there's way more risk with doing it that way. So if there's a safer way to do it, like using a monolift.
Yeah. So when you're implementing any of the eccentric methods
Yep.
into, and all the person's real history with it is what I just talked about. You know, standing, holding a little bit slower on the way down because the weight's heavier.
Yeah.
Where would you start? Which methods?
So I generally start, if you have like a beginner who hasn't done a lot of eccentric training, you're just looking at regular reps with really slow tempo. When I say really slow, we've probably programmed as slow as like 20 seconds. Depends on the movement as well, in terms of
Yeah,
how
like your
long the
range of
range of motion is.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got
Wrist curl.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like you've got Naomi, who's like 5'2" on a good day. Her 20 second eccentric squat's going to involve her not moving and just kind of eroding away slowly. Whereas like me, I go like double the distance. Maybe that's realistic for me, right? But when you're looking at programming eccentric reps for a beginner with eccentric training, it's more about time spent in the eccentric phase rather than the specific. So I would probably say like 6 or 7 seconds, probably the minimum. You could go as high as 10, 15, 20 if you really want to. But you're probably looking at more like 40 to 60 seconds total per set. So obviously then the number of reps in the set is going to be purely dependent on the eccentric tempo that you use. But anything more than that, you're going to find that people just cannot concentrate for longer than that anyway.
So when you're programming it over a progression, say this is going to happen in 3 sessions, 4 sessions, you're going to work towards the 40 seconds total.
Well, the way we generally would do it in that, because this would be like early in the foundation phase, early in the off season, whatever. It would either be a case of the eccentric would increase every week, so the tempo would get slower every week, but your goal would be to keep the same weight.
Yeah.
Or you would add a rep, something like that to increase the volume. Would be cumulative over that training block.
Yeah.
Because
Okay,
of
so
the kind
the
of
volume as far as the weight, and how do you define volume?
That would be, for me, I would look at it as like still sets times reps times tempo.
Okay, times tempo.
Times tempo, yeah.
Okay, so it's a different calculation.
Yeah,
there.
and because we're looking at improving tolerance for eccentric loading and control.
Yes.
So that's our currency, is time under slow tempo, and so that's why times the eccentric tempo, right?
Yeah.
So then you get a cumulative time spent in performing that slow eccentric. It would probably be like 50 to 60% range. at that point.
Well, that's better though, because you got to look at some type of progressive overload, which you know, evil, right?
Yeah.
You know, over a period of time, but it gets dicey when you're adding in different things like that, where if you're not calculating that, you can just end up actually going the other way.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, because the weight goes up, and then accidentally, you know, the eccentric.
No, you're absolutely, and that's.
I think the focus is more on like increasing the time and attention whilst keeping the weight the same. So it isn't like like most people think progression is more weight, but actually with this method, you're not increasing the weight. You're just increasing your time under tension, a total from that session. So whether that's like longer time per rep or extra reps.
Yes.
Like you're just increasing the time under tension, and the goal is to keep the weight the same every week. I mean, if you can go up a little bit, but the emphasis isn't really on weight necessarily.
No. I mean, I think when we program as well, which is maybe a little bit different to how other people do things, during the off season or accumulation, you know, whatever the fuck you want to call it, you're a while away from where you need to be strong, whatever.
Yeah.
We really like to stay away from higher loading for the most part, and we like to use methods to make things hard.
Yes.
Yeah. And not even necessarily like it wouldn't necessarily be like, say if you were looking at squat, for example, it wouldn't necessarily be back squat.
No.
Yeah.
Like we would use a different variation. Obviously, like depending on the person and how much weight they're moving, you like in off season, you want to keep the weight low.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you want to make the most of other methods like this and other movements to improve the, like say for a powerlifter, the big three. For an athlete, they would necessarily wouldn't be doing a back squat anyway. We would be trying to improve their front squat or.
So to me, that's the whole goal of that off season, though, right? Is you want to
keep the weight low.
You want to keep the weight as low as you possibly can.
Yeah.
So you're going to find the exercises you really suck at,
Yeah.
and then figure out a way to suck at them even more.
Yeah, that's
you know, which is this control. It sucks, right? But it's part of it because you still need to accumulate the tissue damage.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
For progression.
Yeah.
You can. If it's an accumulation phase, it's people are going to be like, oh, everybody's got different. Everything got accumulation phases.
Yeah.
You can transfer it later.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's where the critics are going to come. Well, this has no specificity or whatever it is. It's like, kinda, but no.
Not direct.
Not direct.
That's why you don't. That's why you don't go from this to your meat.
Yeah. So you have a transfer.
People forget that it's like a spectrum or a progression system towards it. It's not. You don't go step 1 to step 10. Of course, that makes no fucking sense.
Exactly.
Right? That's not what it's built to do. It's built that they all linearly work on each other. And this is why, like, a lot of the time when we get people who get sick and things like that, they're like, oh, I haven't trained for 2 weeks. Shall I just move to my next block? It's like, no.
Start over.
No, because you're not. If you haven't done block 2, then you're not prepared for block 3. That's how it works. That's the whole point behind it. And it takes, I think, people a while to get their head around that.
Well, I think as Naomi said, that a lot of people are stuck in a paradigm that all progression has to be weight.
Yeah.
Weight has to go up, reps have to go down, and there's so many other variables. And we're just talking about one that has multiple methods to be able to train with.
Yeah.
That is there.
Yeah.
And needs to be utilized, or especially if the goal is to not beat the shit out of yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where maybe in the off season we treat our lifters or strength athletes, whatever, a bit more like we coach like sports athletes. Because if we have like a sport athlete, let's just say like a sprinter who can now squat like 550, 600 on back squat, we'll stop using it. Because what's the point in him chasing a 600 squat? Like, okay, he could get his legs stronger by going from 550 to 600, but what is the nervous system fatigue? What is the injury risk? So we say, okay, we don't back squat for strength anymore. We might back squat for power or for speed, whatever it might be, but now we're going to front squat for strength.
So I can make that same argument with an advanced lifter after a meet.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the more advanced, the longer time they need away from the bar, which is opposite of what people think, more damage.
Yeah. Absolutely right. And then, I mean, like, if you look at like Olympic lifters and stuff, after they do meets, like they have no problem working at like 50, 60% for like 2-3 months. But like in the powerlifting world, that seems to be like, holy shit, all my gains are going to disappear. Like people are just terrified that they're going to get weak. But it's like, if you're working hard, you don't get weak. Like there's a difference between being strong and expressing strength.
Good point.
Yeah. So peaking for me is working on your ability to express strength in whatever the test that your competition is. And then building strength can be a very, very different process that doesn't necessarily feed directly. I mean, that's why we peak. That's why we don't just rock up to a comp after a normal training block, because that process happens and works. And I think the more people get their head around that, the more they'll be willing to accept using different methods, varying their exercises a bit more, doing the shit they don't want to do.
Well, I think, it's in full transparency with most of these people, they are using the methods, but it's haphazardly.
Yeah.
They'll see somebody do a top, I'll guarantee there's people that are going to listen to this that we just talked about a top-down deadlift. They're going to just go fucking do it.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like they'll see it, they won't really understand what the reason for it being put into something is, and think, oh, that's cool, I'm going to do that next deadlift day. So I'm going to do my normal deadlift, and I'm going to do that, or it's my next match. Yeah. So they all do it.
Yeah.
So they're not afraid to do it, they're just afraid to do it and tell them. Oh, yeah, that's fucked up.
No,
right?
I get. They're scared to do maybe the grunt work before the cool methods.
Yeah.
Like with when I say to other coaches, like, we like to get our powerlifters with eccentric hooks, which we'll talk about at some point, like able to control about 120% of their 1 rep max on the way down. With about 4 or 5 seconds, they're like, shit, that sounds awful. That's crazy. That's but it's like, you don't see the 6 months they spend doing this type of training that leads up to that. If they're doing a weight releaser block before their peak, they might also have weight releases in the block before, which are, say, 90 to 100%. And they've done a month of that.
Yes.
Higher volumes. And then they bump it up to that if they show the prerequisite motor control that we want to see. And obviously there's groundwork that goes in, before that, with the even slower work and the more boring stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, you look at that on the front, and you just chuck someone under 120%. Of course, it's going to fuck you up.
Yeah. So on the bottom end, just controlling the eccentric would fall more in less than sub-maximal. So it's like almost, I don't want to say minimal, but
I get you.
Weights that are typically, here we got to default to percent. So typically 50% below,
absolutely.
For what that's going to be. And then that can progress. So first off, are there other minimal methods that they can use?
What do you mean by minimal in that context?
Say under the beginner. So let's break the methods, because on the extreme end, you're going to have Circa-Maximal, which is 120. You're getting there, and then there's going to be the sub-maximal, right, and then maximal, or maximal, then sub-maximal, then under sub-maximal is just dicey, right? Because how do you define under 50%?
I get you.
You can define it as far as the weight, but when the rep range can triple based upon the output and motivation, it becomes a little different.
No, I get you. I mean, then what we generally do, if the loads are super low, then what we generally do is basically we let the load dictate the volume at that point, and we test motor control by having them do it as slow as they can.
Yes.
So then they don't have a prescribed tempo, but basically the goal is, okay, we don't want you going above, let's say it's a rehab client or whatever, right?
Yeah, so now
we don't want you to lift more than 60 pounds or whatever, because that's what your physio has said you can do, whatever. Okay, that's fine. Your goal is to not fail, but get to like RPE, whatever. Again, what the fuck's RPE? But to get 1 or 2 reps in reserve, whatever, with that weight as soon as possible, in as little reps as possible. So then the goal is, okay, so the slower and the more control I use, the more muscular tension I build during the eccentric, the harder I work on the eccentric, the earlier I tap out.
Yes.
And then you basically start milking whatever weight that you want to use in that phase for as much as you can.
How so?
Because you're making it hard as humanly possible by going as slow as humanly, and also treating it, you can't really, I don't want to give it like a fancy name to make it sound super smart, but like we would call them something like maximal tension reps. So what the goal is like, okay, it's 40%, but treat it like it's 140%, make it look like it's 140% on the way down. And then you make the weight difficult through your own effort that you're applying to it.
Yes.
Basically would be.
Now, what do they do on the concentric before they come up for the second? Just normal concentric.
Normal concentric.
So not explosive concentric for this.
No, it'd just be normal. I mean, we do program slow concentrics.
No, I get it.
In there. And actually, slow concentrics can actually be really good if you've got lifters who like to push shit too hard, too early all the time. because then it instantly is going to cut down the weight they can use quite. I mean, like we said, if you're stronger on the eccentric than you are on the concentric, when you slow down the eccentric, doesn't affect what you can lift on the concentric as much as if you slow down the concentric. You start doing 3 or 4 second concentrics and the weights just tumble down. So again, in that really early phase, that could be another method where you start going like 5 up, 5 down.
Yeah.
For example, but we don't use that as often.
So then where do you determine the reps in reserve? Do you base it upon if the concentric is starting to drop or the eccentric can't hit the time?
It will 90% be the eccentric.
I got it.
That's going at that point. Because concentrically, they're not actually working that hard at that point. So it's either going to be the eccentric in terms of, it's usually going to be the ability to maintain the positions that you want them to. Like they might well still be doing the kind of tempo that you want them to, but something is going to be off because they're going to be reverting to some kind of compensation pattern.
Okay.
That's when you usually cut it short.
So if that is a starting block and you're going to progress with the eccentric methods, what would be in that middle block? Submaximal.
So submaximal. That would be the regular slow eccentric works then.
Okay.
Or what we like to kind of use as a bridge then is doing a thing called contrast sets.
Yes.
So what you do is you take, say, like a set of 6, and you alternate between going slow and doing a normal rep. And the idea is simply that you learn
You alternate the reps.
you alternate the rep style. Or it could be 2 slow, 1 fast, however the fuck you want to do it, right?
Yeah.
But the goal is simply to take the tension and the motor control that the lifter has in the slow rep and then have them directly try and translate that then to the quicker rep. So the goal is move faster without sacrificing tension.
Yes.
Because that's a problem a lot of the times. Like people do like speed work and stuff with bands, and like the idea with bands is, and we'll cover that. And people probably call me a heretic for what I say, whatever. But over speed eccentrics are really powerful, but 90% of the people who, at least powerlifters who do them, aren't ready to do over speed eccentrics.
Yeah.
So they don't end up performing an over speed eccentric because they don't have the eccentric structure to allow the band to pull them and be.
No, I would agree with you 100%.
So we use that as like that method as a really good intermediary then to start transferring that level of tension and motor control into the quicker reps.
I mean, just to stay on the point that you just made, it's pretty easy to see this. Right? Just watch them. They can't control the fucking thing on the way down. So if they can't, you can see it. It's like, whoa, like, oh, shit. Like, that's a clue, you know, and...
No, you're right. I mean, so one of 2 things either ends up happening. They either end up going fast and thinking that's the goal, it's fine, but the actual movement is shit. Or to maintain the form and the technique that you want, they can't go fast.
I also think this plays into if somebody uses a whole lot of bands, right, and then they take them off, they're unstable, right? So the way that's been explained is the bands are grounding you. Right, because it's like 2 other feet, you know, that are there, where that's part of it. But the other part is you never learned how to control that eccentric, right? So now you took something away, you know. So yes, it's gonna feel way more fucked up because they didn't build the eccentric; they traded it. I guess is the best way that I get you say it.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So then they take them off, and they haven't gained the benefit of an overspeed eccentric.
Yes.
So they haven't learned how to maintain more stiffness at the bottom. They haven't got a better stretch reflex if that's what they're using when they lift. And then they take the bands off, and now the motor pattern has changed.
Yes.
So now they have to relearn the motor pattern, but they haven't gained
exactly.
in return.
Yeah.
So it's just a bad trade-off at that. And chains can do the same, but it tends to be less pronounced.
Yes.
In terms of throwing people off in that regard.
So back to what we were talking about with the submaximal moving forward through the training.
So then, do you want to take over? I'm just talking too much.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Then what we generally do is just start slowly bringing down the eccentric tempo into more slow but controlled ranges. So we're talking like 6 to 4 second eccentrics, and then implementing them in more traditional strength work.
Now, if it's a power lifter, the 4 seconds could actually be getting pretty close to what they're normal.
No, that's true, and that's why it'll vary.
Okay.
Basically, what you're looking for is like 3 seconds slower than their lifting tempo.
All right.
You know, if they're an explosive lifter, it might be 4 seconds. If they're a grinder, it might be 6 or 7.
But it's over their normal. So
Yeah,
if
so
somebody's
it's
looking
just
to do
slightly.
it.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
what feels slow, but not painfully slow.
Yeah.
To that person.
Yes.
So then we'll start putting that in traditional strength work. But then with the system that we use with most powerlifters, we're training whole body 3 days a week.
Yeah.
So they're doing some kind of squat usually or hinge 3 days a week so that you have time. They'll be doing an eccentric workout. They'll be doing an isometric based workout and a concentric based workout.
But these are separated though. So the eccentric is
on its own day.
It's on its closer to the first of the week.
Yeah,
or the
because-
first of the microcycle, like
Yeah.
if you want to define it.
Eccentric is, as we said, it causes more muscle damage.
It's the one that you takes longer to recover from, so
Yeah.
it makes sense having it first.
Yes.
And it's the most neurologically demanding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what you can do is, if you keep the stimulus or the focus as unilateral as possible, so like Monday is all eccentric dominant work, Wednesday is all isometric, it limits how taxing it is for the nervous system,
Yeah, 'cause
rather
you're-
than trying to swap.
Like your brain is almost like working in that one type of method for that day, and it's going to work best if you're just focusing on that type of movement and then doing that per workout. Yeah, but like we'll generally do like an extra day on top of that, so not just 3 days, but the 4th day, and the 4th day would just be like
Gap work.
accessory. We'd call it like a gap workout, like it's like accessory work, and you know, like whatever specific weaknesses you have, you can target those, but it's like really low key
Yeah.
exercises. So
Yeah.
like you're not picking up and doing like barbell work. It's,
So it's the shit that the big lifts can't hit very well. Because I mean,
Yeah.
our approach when we do, and again, a lot of people are holy shit, 3 body 3 days a week, but you can adapt to it, and if it's all about how you program it at the end of the day.
Yeah,
and
and
again,
it's not necessarily squat, bench, deadlift.
no, and
like-
again, you use variations you rubbish at,
Yeah.
so that the loads aren't super high. The eccentric and the isometric, so like the pauses and the tempos, mean that you can hit high RPEs without going super heavy. But really, like the goal for us is, I think for most coaches should be, what is the minimal amount of exercises I can use to get this person better? So if we can do that in 3 lifts, for example, say we do like a squat, a push, and then either a hinge or a pull Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then we just fill in the fluff work on the Saturday, you should be able to get people stronger with that. Like that's more than like that's not even a skeleton program as far as I'm concerned. Like you shouldn't need a dozen different variations all the time to get people strong. You know, so that's kind of the way we go at it is, how can we spend the most time under a bar, but also be efficient at getting these people strong, basically.
The trick is to stay with that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
No, you're absolutely right,
so
yeah.
it's kind of the same the same challenge that high frequency
Yep.
training is going to have, where, and I think it's important that people understand all training methodologies, but they
Yeah.
need to actually take the time to really understand it, because
Yep.
they'll take, let's say, what you're talking about, then they'll do that, and they'll be like, okay, now I got to go do my other stuff. Like, dude, no.
No. I mean, if you did it properly, you shouldn't really be able to do the
No,
other
but
stuff.
you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
No, I do,
mean, they
right.
will, right? Because now you're already, all these programs, no matter what it is, that are intelligently put together,
Yeah.
are all operating on a very low recovery threshold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like we're trying to maximize the most you can out of this day.
Yeah.
So you want to do the least amount possible to make the progress, but you still got to do enough to be able to create the tissue damage
Yeah.
to make the progress. So there's
absolutely.
some float in there,
Yeah, absolutely.
but not 5 other exercises of
No.
10 to 15 reps of going to failure on stupid shit.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
but it happens. You know?
It does.
I still think there's like this big mentality in training that you have to trash yourself every session to make progress, and that's really not the case at all. In fact, you won't. If you're not going to recover, then you aren't going to make progress.
Yes.
Like you want to create, like you said, enough tissue damage, but then the progress you make is based on how you recover from that. So like what happens when you go away? If you've caused too much damage and then you're coming back 2 days later and you're still not recovered from that, you haven't made progress.
Yeah, it's
So-
an interesting thing where I kind of picked that up when I was younger. Like if I'm making progress, I don't want to mess it up.
Yeah. Why
Yeah.
fuck it out?
Right? You know, and
Yeah.
fortunately I learned that very young, because And like, why would I do more, which is probably a greater risk of not making progress than if I was to do less?
Yeah, I was about to say, like, as a coach, you're almost always more likely to do more damage overtraining an athlete than undertraining. I mean,
Yeah.
if an athlete, especially if an athlete is strong and experienced and they can train intensely with decent poundages, it's probably pretty hard to undertrain them. You know, if they can really push hard on sets with good technical, like, you're going to have to try pretty hard to undertrain that person unless they've come to you from a training system that's super high volume.
Yeah, no, that's what bodybuilding. That's another, that's another conversation. But even there, a lot of that higher volume work isn't pushed to the same thresholds of what we're talking about.
No,
here.
absolutely not.
And if it was, they couldn't do it.
No, absolutely. And again, even within that, there's an overarching principle that training is a stimulus that you adapt to, and volume is part of that stimulus, and you adapt to training volume. So realistically, even if you're a bodybuilder, okay, the intensity is different, the exercise, but your volume should probably still be cyclical, because you can't just elevate volume forever.
No.
Right? You can't just keep going, like, unless you want to start spending 20 hours in the gym, and even if you could, can you recover from it? No. So at some point there needs to be a resensitization period or a deload, as you know, where you go to a reduced kind of maintenance volume, so your body then is responsive to the training load again. You know, so even in that context, it needs to be cycled, even if it's not maximal.
If it's not, and it's not a block that's being put in or whatever it's going to be, it will be.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
Like, if it's not programmed in there,
It'll happen.
It will happen.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
Because you're just going to get fucked up.
Yeah,
It's just not
absolutely.
going to be able to, you're going to get hurt.
Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people like hate deloads because let's be honest, a lot of people are more addicted to training than they are to results.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they don't want to not train. Even if in their head they know that it's what they need to do, they don't want to take a step back. So what we generally do is the first week of every training block's like a partial deload. So it's like 20 to 30% either lower intensity or volume compared to what we want them to do.
Yeah.
But then because it's built in and it doesn't say deload in big fucking letters on the top of it, they just
They
do
don't
it.
realize.
And then if you're using these kind of methods, for example, and the exercise has changed or the tempo has changed or whatever, that first week they're fucking around trying to find out, well, is this a good
That's
weight for
enough.
this?
That's enough to trigger a deload. So
Yeah. So they kind of do it without even knowing they're doing it
Yeah.
then. So that's
Yeah.
how we kind of build it in, if you like, if it's a 4-week block, that's usually what we'll do with the first one.
Yeah.
And then it just incrementally ramps up and then comes back down.
Now, as the eccentric phases keep going up, then where does that go after that sub-maximal? So now you're getting into maximal and circa-maximal eccentric work. What does that look
wanna
like?
take-
no, you go ahead.
Okay. So that's generally where we like to start including
Like normal movement.
Yeah, normal movement with like so we talked about the contrast sets. Now you can start doing that with even heavier loads. So we actually might program doubles, but with the first eccentric is slow. But in a perfect world, that's out now where we'd start overloading the eccentric with things like weight releases or eccentric hooks.
Yeah.
Now, in the first phase, it would generally be something like 90 to 100% their 1 rep max total on the bar. And you're looking at 70 to 80% of their actual 1 rep max then in terms of bar weight. So you're going to get about 15% extra each per releaser. And then you're doing basically cluster work because you have to replace the releases every rep, right?
Yeah.
So on the eccentric focus day, we'd be looking at, again, we do most of the heavy eccentric work still with a controlled eccentric. So again, for average Joe, it's going to be like 5 seconds. If they're a grinder, it might be 6, 7, whatever. But they're going to be doing clusters just like you do normal clusters. So maybe sets of 4 to 6, but with the releases on the eccentric phase. And they would be coming off as close to the bottom position as you can. You don't want them to come off at the very bottom because it starts to kind of fuck with the stretch reflex a little bit. So you basically, if you say you're a squatter and you get a stretch, you want it to come off just before the dip, basically then. So your body rigidity in the nervous system is ready to go into that stretch reflex at like 100%, whatever it is, it comes off, and then you get an exaggerated stretch reflex out at the bottom, which once you're used to them, can mean that you can then concentrically perform the rep faster. The other method that we might use is if they still need more hypertrophy, the weight releases can actually act as a really good like pre-activation tool. So say you're doing sets of like 5 to 6, at like 80 to 85%. You got 80% on the bar, and you might put 100% on the bar for the first rep.
Yeah.
And then what happens is you do the slow eccentric on the first rep, the releases come off, it acts as a pre-activation for the nervous system. Nervous system is ready for 100%. Then you have them rep out the weight without the releases on. And again, once they're used to it, because again, there's a grace period there where they suck at it and it takes it out of them, they can actually end up performing more reps with that 80% than they would if it wasn't there.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, so that would be like the pre-peak phase or just a bit before that generally. That's where we'd look to introduce the weight releases and then have them working at like 100% of what. So they're not going above and beyond what they've done before yet, but that would be what we're looking at.
So if we dial this back to the very first, just controlling the rep speed,
Yeah.
you know, block A, right? All the way to the end of this block, how long are we talking?
Okay, so generally we'd be probably at this point we'd be like 12 to 16 weeks in, depending on how experienced they are.
All right, so basically three blocks or something like that.
Yeah,
over,
depending,
so-
you know, like experienced lifters are going to adapt to
Yeah.
methods more quick, so they might have 3-week blocks. A beginner might have 5-week blocks, whatever it be. But weight releases wouldn't necessarily be something we'd use with beginners or even like early into it. It'd be
So if it wasn't that, then what would be the last block?
the last block, if they're a beginner, would generally we'd be doing like overloaded eccentrics. Do I say overloaded for that phase? So like, you know, say that phase is generally using 80%, they might be using 90%, and we'd generally just be having them do them like down to pins. And they might even be like midpoint pins at that point in time, depending on how good their muscular control is, because then you don't have the added instability of the weight releases. And then what you can do is, rather than fucking around with the tempo, is you can move the pins down as the block goes on, so they get closer and closer to that bottom position with that 90% or 100%, whatever it might be. Just acclimating them to controlling the eccentric with that load, but in a more simple, less stressful way, basically.
That would suck to do, by the way.
It does.
Just because you got to take the fucking weight off to put it
Yeah.
back in the...
It's a pain in the
Yeah.
ass.
Yep.
But if it's
It
the only
works
thing...
really well, though.
No, if it's the only thing you're doing.
But again, you can have a spotter each side, and you can go down to the pin, have a whip off a plate, which you put over the top of the collars, and then come back out.
But now you're talking two different things, though.
I know, but I'm just saying that's another
No,
way
no, I
you
get
can
it,
do
I get it, but
And you're
that's-
right, it is totally different.
It's totally different, and it's they would be programmed differently,
Yes, they would, absolutely.
right? Because now you're adding concentric to something that, you know, is we can geek out on that, but it's
So if they're doing those negative only reps, they might be like 3 or 4 sets of 1.
okay.
That's it.
Now, what if it is the negative with concentric with a strip concentric? So
Yeah.
down, weight off.
We
up.
would treat that the same as you treat the weight releaser, because basically it's just it's a bad version of a weight releaser, really.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
so generally in that phase we're looking at like 3 sets of 4 to 6 or something like that.
Okay, so the volume would be volume is sets times reps.
In
It's
this
going to be higher.
circumstance, because generally at this point we're not going to be playing around with tempos too much. We've got that what we would describe as slow-ish tempo, right?
Yeah.
Slower than they would lift maximally, so depending on the person, and we generally stick with that. Then we don't like to fuck around with that too much when the weights start getting 90, 100, 110%.
Yeah.
It starts to, because if you've got 110% on your back, can you really think about whether it's 5 or 6 seconds?
No, it's just going to be slower.
It's just slow. So at that point, it's like you have to, even though it's an eccentric focus and the tempo is important, you have to start giving them a little bit more grace with it, because what you're mainly looking for is the motor control. So what we'd be looking for then is the tempo the same throughout the whole range of motion?
Yeah.
Or is there a point where they quicken up because they can't control it? You know, like, are they getting to 2 inches from the chest and then dumping it, or whatever it might be? It's more of then it's kind of more qualitative, I suppose. At that point, that's where kind of the coach watching kind of becomes more important, because they're not going to feel that even necessarily, because if it's 100% on the bar, including releases, and they're moving, it's hold on for dear life almost, you know, until they get really used to them.
Yes.
So the quality of the movement at that point becomes really important, and you can't get too nitpicky about, oh, wow, that was 4.5 rather than 5 selvage, you know what I mean? You just can't do that at that point.
So then what movements, right? So if we're talking like lower body emphasis, right? Then is the lower body and the upper body emphasis the same day if it's eccentric?
Yeah.
Yep. So
Okay.
it's whole body
So
eccentric,
whole body, so it's
whole
both
body
the same day.
isometric, whole body concentric.
Okay. And then did I miss anything with the eccentric loading phase?
No, I mean, then there would be a stage beyond that where you aim to overload the eccentric more.
Yes.
So the goal would be pre-peak. So when I say pre-peak, peaking for us is usually just a higher frequency of work on the straight comp lifts for a few weeks.
Yes.
So you start taking out fancy methods sometimes of that. We might still stick eccentrics and pauses, but it will all be on the comp lifts and they'll be minimal.
Yes.
So like it might be like a 2-second pause mid-range on the bench rather than 3 2-second pauses on these or whatever, you know, it'll be simpler so the load can be higher. So pre-peak before that, that's when on the eccentric days, we're looking for people to be able to hold at least the weight that we want them to lift at their test.
Yes.
So we're looking for 110%, whatever it might be, minimum, usually. Not that they're necessarily going to hold 110% or lift that. I mean, it's great if they do. But we want them to have, like we said earlier, we want them to have a strength reserve. We want them to have a gap between the concentric and eccentric strength. So ideally, if they're advanced, we're shooting for more like 120%. If they're more of a beginner, or sorry, it'd be intermediate, more like 110. If they're a beginner, then we'd be looking at doing those slow eccentrics with like close to what their 1 rep max was before the training cycle.
Yes.
Because at that point, you don't need to get too fancy. It's more just about load habituation and motor control.
Yes.
Which comes to them easier with lower loads than someone who's more experienced.
So then after that phase there, it goes back to phase 1.
Well, they do their test or whatever.
Yeah,
it be,
yeah, then
and
it
then you
goes
go back, right back to the super slow work. And like,
Yeah.
all of our lifters hate the first block after a comp because they know what's coming.
Yeah.
It's like 8 to 10 second tempos at least on everything, 3 pauses on the concentric on stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's all the shit they hate, but it's all the stuff that builds up the connective tissues, the ligaments and the tendons and the stuff that nobody really wants to train.
Yeah, exactly.
the rest
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
time. And then, sorry, go on.
No, I was gonna say, and they're in a different condition at that time.
Yeah.
You know, so it makes that first one even worse.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because they're all primed and ready for max force output, 1 rep maxes, and you're like, here's sets of 10 with slow tempos, good luck.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that's the whole point, right?
Yes.
Like you're meant to do stuff you're not adapted to. And also, I mean, there's no point lifting heavy straight after meet, 'cause all you're going to do is be fucking disappointed anyway, right? Because if you peak properly, you're going to be 5-10% weaker.
Well, even if they don't like it, if they want to find a different training principle or a different training
Yeah.
philosophy, they're still doing the same thing.
Yes,
They
absolutely.
all do the same
Let's say
thing.
it's just different ways of
It's just
preparing for the
different
same
ways,
outcome. Yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
So is that the eccentric? Have we covered pretty much?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that's a good reason. I would say maybe the only thing we missed is like if we get people who are like really bad on the eccentric, or if we get athletes who we need to be fast, then we might use a different progression system, because the goal is not necessarily to get them strong as possible, but to get them able to move eccentrically or do things like overspeed eccentrics as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. So that might be a slightly different progression system.
And how would that look? Because there's along with, I mean, when you're talking to other sports, we start to talk about there's deceleration, which is eccentric contraction, right? So walk that through a little
So
bit.
that I mean, you'll still have 5 or 6 phases there, but again, you'd still start off with the foundational work with really slow tempos. But then instead of moving on to heavier loading, the goal would be to progressively get them using slightly more of a stretch reflex and slightly more tempo at certain points, but in a controlled manner. So like phase 2 would be doing like take a squat, because it's an easy variation that kind of works well with jumping principles and things like that. They'd start doing things like 1.5 reps. So they build up their control in the bottom half of the range of motion by going all the way down, come back up to a knee angle of about 90 to 100 degrees, because that's where they're going to jump and sprint from, then drop back down under control
Yeah.
and come back up. Then the step after that would be, okay, we'll do the first half rep slow, and then come back up to that 90 to 100 degree joint angle, pause and drop. And stay stiff while you get the bounce. And then you'd move it on, then you'd start doing pauses. So they'd just do a normal eccentric, but they'd stop just above the bottom. So there's no extra half and shit at the bottom anymore.
Yeah.
Pause, bounce. And if they start getting good at that, we incrementally increase the pause point. So they're getting more free fall. So the stretch reflex is more demanding. Then eventually we move to the point of when the pause is kind of like the top third. That's when we try to start moving then to fast eccentrics. So the goal now is no longer to be slow and control. The goal now is how well can you move, what weight can you move fast with good rigidity?
Would those fast eccentrics include things like depth jumps or just, drop push-ups?
Yeah, but they would be programmed separately.
Yeah.
If you like. Wait, I'm just talking just about
Yeah.
gym work here. I mean, depth jumps would be right at the end.
Yes.
With like overspeed. Because they are like the most demanding
the
plyometric exercise there is, right?
Yeah.
So then we'd move to, once they can do fast eccentrics with like 60 to 70% with really good technique, that might be when we'd look at introducing like bands to do overspeed work, which would also be hopefully when they're ready for things like depth jumps. But like that progression obviously has a different thinking method to
of course.
getting someone strong. But again, that's what I'm saying. Like we see a lot of people doing band work, they jump straight up here to the overspeed work, and they haven't done all this shit down here to actually earn the right to do them properly, and they don't end up getting anything from it then.
Well, it is, to really think it through, since I threw the depth jump out there, it's kind of like throwing depth jumps at somebody that's not ready to do them.
Well, there's a great way to know if you're ready for them. Do one. And if your depth jump is not higher than your vertical jump on the spot, then you're not ready.
Yeah.
Because if you can do a depth jump properly, you get an exaggerated stretch reflex and you can jump higher than you would if you were on the floor. If you're not ready for it, your GTOs stop the stretch reflex and then you end up performing worse.
Yes.
So that's a great way of knowing if you're ready for it or
Yeah.
And 99% of the time, if you have to ask the question, the answer is no.
Yeah, of course. Then is the isometric method, comes... Is that midweek then?
Yeah, that's midweek.
Okay.
So the reasoning behind that is usually that eccentric is the most demanding in terms of muscular damage and in terms of the nervous system. Isometric contractions cause very little muscle damage. None if you're doing a pure isometric. And because of that, then they're a bit less demanding to recover from, which means then if you're doing your heavier concentric work on the Friday, you're not as beat up, ready for it. And also, if you're not fully recovered from the eccentric work on the Monday, doesn't matter quite so much because we're not doing any work that gives you a lot of muscle damage then on the Wednesday.
So when we're talking the isometric, are we talking, because there's quasi-isometric, there's yielding, and then there's different things, right? So how does that progress?
So early on with isometric training, we're again using it primarily as a tool to increase kind of active stability.
Define that.
So act is your ability to hold joint angles under load. So basically, just taking key positions or weak positions of a lift and strengthening them through motor control and increased ability to activate their synergists, antagonists, and all that stuff. So very similar to the eccentric in the early phase, it's going to be generally lots of pause work, but multiple pauses during regular reps, so statodynamic.
Okay.
So that could look as simple as something like front squat with 2-3 second pauses on the eccentric. Now, generally we don't use more than like 6 to 8 seconds worth of pauses in a rep. Because again, it gets to a point of diminishing returns and the load ends up becoming so low that the training stimulus is kind of hampered, if you like. So you can kind of split that however you want, If you've got no more than 8 seconds of pausing per rep, you want to do a 6-second pause halfway down, that's fine. That's all your pause worked up, or you want to do tool, whatever. But generally, we'd be looking for 6 to 8 seconds of isometric work within the rep in that early phase. And then we would progress it generally through either by increasing the pause duration, or if we want load to go up, we would actually start moving the position of the pauses.
Okay.
So concentric pausing is easier than eccentric pausing. Sorry, other way around. Apologies.
No,
you're right. Yeah, you're right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So concentric pausing is harder than so you could start off with 3 pauses on the concentric and then bleed them over, or swap them over to the eccentric as the weeks go on if you want them to use more load.
Yeah.
Or if you want to go the other route, make things harder without the weight going up, you start with them on the eccentric and you move them to the concentric then as the weeks go on. So by week 4 or whatever ends up being, you end up with all 3 pauses being on the concentric rather than...
Then how are you calculating the volume here?
So the volume here would be the same thing, pause time times set times reps.
Okay. All right.
But Yeah, it's as simple as that, really.
Yeah.
But you do have to take into account where the pauses are. So like a top third pause is easier than a bottom position, but you start getting into that and it gets a bit too nitpicky, if you like, in terms of calculating the volume.
Maybe, but it still has to be thought about.
No, you're absolutely right.
Because that can be a whole form of progression there.
Yeah.
Or, progression or
Yeah.
degression. What the fuck would that be? Degression. regression.
But that's why we'll either change the sets and reps or we'll change the pauses. We don't like to do, because it fucks with the volume. You end up not being able to track things properly then, right? So we'll usually only move one variable. We'll keep the pauses work the same and make the volume high, like add a rep every week, add a set every week, real simple. Or we'll keep the traditional volume the same through the block, and then the progression system would be the pauses itself.
Yeah, now on this, the weight's not changing either, right?
Well, the goal, if the pauses are getting harder, the goal would be to keep the same weight.
Yeah.
That's the progression in itself then. And likewise, if the reps are going up, the goal would be to keep the same weight.
Yes.
Because that you don't need to load it higher, then you've already done more work.
Then how's the weight calculated? How's that figured out?
Again, usually we're looking at that phase, we're looking at like 50 to 60%, and generally at that point, when you get to methods like that, people have like no ballpark figure for, we're generally just using RPE for difficulty there to track whether we're in the right ballpark.
Yeah.
So we're looking at like 8.5 usually in that kind of phase.
What follows that? So if there was a progression of blocks with the eccentric, how does this progression work with the isometrics?
So again, you'd start either reducing the pause time down,
yes,
or vary the exercises so that the loading can go up.
Yes.
Now, if you want to start doing non-statodynamic work, so like instead of doing just regular pauses throughout the reps, that's where you could start putting things in like functional isometrics or isometrics and things like that. So the functional isometric is basically where you start. These became really popular when like Bob Hoffman started selling squat racks and stuff, and you had all the safety pins to work with.
Yeah.
So a functional isometric is basically starting with a bar on a pin. Bench press is like the easiest example. And then you'd have another set of pins like 2 or 3 inches above. So the goal is to just press the weight up to the pin and then hold. Now, the reason that they work well...
Well, let's back that down.
Yeah.
Because it's, I have the iso racks, for that kind of stuff. So when you go into pressing into that pin, right, what force are you producing?
Maximal.
Okay. All right. I'm breaking that down because they can.
No, you're right.
That needs to be defined.
A functional isometric is nothing more than a partial rep with an overcoming isometric.
Yes.
Now, overcoming isometrics are great, but we generally put them in later as like an activation tool or to work on a sticking
it's like
point.
something you would do at the very start of the it's not like a main movement, it's something you do at the start of the workout.
Yeah.
Just kind of like a warm-up, I suppose. Yeah, activation.
And then how long are you pressing into it?
So you want to use the same energy system you use when you do a maximal rep. So you're looking at the creatine phosphate system. So anywhere from 6 to 12 seconds. And the progression system there is the time. The reason the functional isometrics work quite well, as opposed to overcoming isometrics in terms of actually carrying over to the lift, is because they are preceded by a partial lift and a concentric action, the motor pattern's more similar. Okay, so you're doing an overcoming isometric, you've got an empty bar, you might move a half inch or an inch or whatever, because you've got a partial rep leading up to it, the firing rate of the neurons and the motor patterning before you hit the pin better mimics what's going to happen in the lift itself.
So it transfers better.
Yeah, so you're moving the bar in the same way that you will before you hit the sticking point that you're trying to work on by the time you hit the pin.
Now, if that has a carryover of, say, 10 to 15 degrees plus or minus,
correct.
You hit different degrees in the same training session, or do you have those come in at different training sessions?
It depends what the goal of that method is. Now, you could do that. You could literally do that at like 3 different heights.
Yeah.
And use that as a training tool all of itself to strengthen the entire range of motion. If you wanted to, we tend not to use that because it becomes a bit cumbersome and time consuming. And if you're training whole body, like our athletes generally do, doing 3 functional isometric setups for 3 lifts in one workout is a long time. It's a lot of setting up.
Yeah.
It's boring.
Unless you got an iso rack, but anyhow.
Yeah, exactly, right? elitefts.com.
Yeah.
So we generally use it to strengthen a sticking point in
Yes.
the lift specifically. So one sticking point.
And where do you go with that sticking point? Because I use these, right?
Yeah.
So if it's somebody in a deadlift and I know where their sticking point is, I always err on the 10 degrees in the stronger point.
Okay.
Right? That way they can recruit more force instead
you.
of going just right where they are, which is going to be probably the least amount of force because they suck there.
Yeah.
Right? And if it is that carryover plus or minus, and usually with this, we're usually talking a deadlift, right?
Yep.
You know, they suck off of the floor, so we'll go here.
Yeah.
Where do you try to go, or you just
So I would generally put it right on the sticking point.
right on the sticking point?
Purely, and when I say sticking point, we're talking about if we watch a lift, that's
Yeah.
where the bar stops.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And the reason for that is obviously you have that grace either side.
Yeah.
But that will depend on how good of a motor learner they are. Like if
True.
they're a motor moron, like they might get 5 degrees
This
either
is true.
side,
This
right?
is
If
true,
they're
yeah.
if they're that gifted athlete and just do whatever the fuck they want all the time, they're
Yeah,
probably getting 15
yeah.
degrees, right? But when you say you stall literally at the kneecap on deadlift,
Yeah.
most of the time you fucked up earlier.
True.
And then you ran out of momentum at your kneecap. So is your sticking point the kneecap or is it just below?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I presume that they just lost momentum where they ultimately got stuck in their sticking points a half inch, an inch lower. That's where I put the pin.
So I think it just really depends on like what you define as your sticking point. Is it where you stopped, or is it where you actually fail the lift, which
Yeah.
is usually before that?
I mean, fortunately, we have room for error. You know,
Yeah.
10 to 15 degrees plus
Yeah.
or minus is pretty good striking range, especially on a short range movement.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
know, so some people's bench, not yours, you know, but some people's bench, you know, would kind of fall into there. One of the other things I've done with that is because I have access to that, I can use that as like a precursor to an actual deadlift. So they can pull into that, step over the bar, and then pull straight through there, which is a different conversation because now that's putting the concentric with your isometric, and like where would that fit though?
Yeah, I mean, I think like you were saying the other day, like you say like it's an eccentric method, but you still have to lift the thing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
So-
yeah.
but
It's just the emphasis.
yeah,
Emphasis?
which one are you emphasizing or which one are you working harder?
Yeah.
That would be how I would describe
Yeah.
what category it falls into, right? But what you're describing there is what we use overcoming isometrics for.
Yes.
We would either do it as a superset like you're describing there, or we do say 3 sets as a warm-up and then get them go into the full lift. It depends on
got it.
it depends on how glaring the sticking point is and again
Yeah.
how good their motor learning is.
I think it's important to combine those two though, because even if you're watching them, because if you don't, you got to be reminded of what position are they actually really in.
Yep.
Because they start doing the pauses and this isometric shit, they'll start to favor the position they're actually strongest in, but not how they're gonna be.
No, I get you.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
And
I mean, how many times do we get sent videos, right? And it's like, pause a third the way down, then 2/3 of the way down,
And it's not actually that.
yeah.
They move like that far. They're like, "That's my first one." You're like,
Yeah. Well, then if you were to transpose that over what the lift looks like with them not doing that, it's two entirely different things. So anytime I can find immediate transference or a way to actually have that transference,
absolutely.
I think from a motor pattern standpoint, it's very helpful.
Yeah, and
know.
again, the thing I was about to say is it depends how glaring the sticking point is, and again, how well they are at transferring.
Yes.
So like, Naomi's really good at transferring strength across lifts.
Yeah.
So you can front squat for a month and then step under the back squat, pretty much be where she was at, and then like if I don't do the comp lift for like a week, I forget what the fuck I'm doing. So I'm the guy who would need to do that because it would have to come immediately after it for me to get any benefit from it. Someone like her could probably do the overcoming isometrics in the warm-up, still have that kind of programmed, for want of a better word, then when she actually steps in to do her working sets later on, you know?
Yeah.
So both completely have merit. It's just making sure that if you're going to go with like your method, that you're not fatigued, I guess,
Yes,
when
yeah.
you go into it.
Yeah. So as you progress with the isometrics, then how does that progress as that
So what?
comes together?
So with that one, we're looking at like 70 to 80%.
Yeah.
And again, we use the time as the progression marker there. So if they're hitting 12 seconds, then the weight goes up. Simple as that for a training block. If we want to make it more intense, then what we do is we take that and we use what's called an isometronic. which basically is the same thing, but you do rep work leading up to it.
Explain.
So same setup, bar, press.
Yeah.
But you do like a set of 6 to 8, then you perform the hold at the end. Mm-hmm. So what you've done, it's quite good for targeted hypertrophy work and also strength. Those are better for strengthening a range of motion rather than a specific sticking point, if that makes sense. Because you're doing like partial pin presses, say, at the bottom half.
Yeah.
Then you're hitting the pin on your sticking point in a fatigue state.
Got it.
So you're teaching your body to try and produce as much force as humanly possible in a fatigue state at your sticking point. Mm-hmm. So you get the benefit of the extra hypertrophy and the rep work. You get a bit more chance to kind of master that range of motion, but then you also get the benefit of the overcoming isometric at the end. And again, we wouldn't expect as big of a pause on the pin because you're fatigued before. So we might look like 6, 7, 8 seconds or whatever. Give them a range, say 6 to 8. And again, the progression system there is, say it's 6 to 8 reps plus an 8-second pause. If they get an 8 and 8, then they move up in weight. Mm-hmm. And generally speaking, we're looking at loading in like 70 to 80% range for those. The only I say problem with those is because they are really intense. So you're performing overcoming isometric, really fatigued. They require a lot less volume. Mm-hmm. So you might only do one all-out set like that with like one preceding easier rep.
Yeah.
And that would be it. Whereas on the functional isos, you can probably keep going and do 3 or 4 sets. But you would never do that before and then go and jump on the platform and do your deadlift, for example.
Yeah.
But that would be probably a method that we'd put the block after if we were still wanting to work on that kind of method, if you like, but it's in a more intense way.
Yeah. Then what would be the peak of that method?
So then the peak would be generally doing like Supra-Max work.
Okay.
So that can be lifting off a partial pin and holding. So let's say you're doing a squat. You set the bar just below a midpoint. You squat up like an inch and hold. So basically the goal would be to pause at the point where basically your knee and the hip is bent about 90 degrees where the shear stress is highest.
Yeah.
And then have them hold that.
Yeah.
As heavy as humanly possible for, again, probably like 6 seconds at most. But again, our preferred method there, if we've got a more advanced lifter, would again to bring the weight releases in.
Yeah.
And now what we'd be looking to do is rather than do slow eccentrics, we do pauses with the releases to strengthen the point they're weak at.
How so?
So you have them pause on the eccentric at their sticking point.
Yeah.
And you have the releaser come off straight after the sticking point.
Okay.
So you teach them how to produce force and stabilize a Supra-Maximal load in their sticking point. Unless it's at the very bottom, then it can become a little bit sketchy. Then the releases come off immediately after and they perform the rest of the rep. That's generally our preferred method for like pre-peak there. But we would also, those Supra-Maximal holds work well, or even at that point, it could even just be like walkouts on heavy supports. So like press off a pin, hold, or just even unrack the bar and hold that, just to get like the Golgi tendon organ desensitization and get them used to handling the weight. But at the end of the day, holding, people forget that. At the end of the day, there's still a lot of active stability involved at holding the bar at the top.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Because you're furthest from your anchor point at the end of the day. So holding a heavy bar out at arm's length is still a lot of work just because you're not muscularly loaded as much. So that's the way we generally would introduce that there as well.
So would you consider things like high pin pulls, high board presses, that isometric day type work?
They would have to be done, I wouldn't say board presses because you can support it on the board.
Yeah, so it'd have to be a pin.
So it would be like a freestanding version of it.
What do you mean?
Like an imaginary board. So come down, pause where the full board would be, pause there.
Yeah, okay, fuck that.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
But it works.
Yes.
It's just really hard.
Yeah.
But again, you'd be amazed at how many people can't even put, let's say 95% on the bar and unlock, bring it 2 inches and stop. Mm-hmm. They can't do it. They're so reliant on movement for the stability that, I mean, really, if you ask them to press from a pin for those last 2 inches, what are they going to load up?
Yeah.
For reps, no problem. You ask them to just take their 1 rep max and then hold it with nothing supporting it. And that's what I mean. You end up seeing that a lot of people have really, really big deficits in these postural strength or eccentric strength areas when you start like really looking at these things and taking away maybe some of the safety blankets or whatever that people use in a lot of their training. Like there is no reason you shouldn't be able to hold your max there.
In the strongest point.
Yeah, you really should be able, and if you can, it makes you think, well, what if your rep is slow on the way up? And it almost becomes isometric like, and you get to here and it stalls.
Yes.
Then you're done. Whereas if you're capable of holding that position very well, in a very stable environment, then you've got a chance to fight through it, right?
Yes.
Like most people at some point on a 1RM are going to perform an isometric whether they like it or not.
Yeah, yeah.
So it pays dividends to have them isometrically strong through as much of the range of motion as they can. And obviously you tailor it to the sticking point more often than not, but it pays all the way through.
Yes. So that would be that peak end, right?
Yeah.
And then it would just go right back, just like the
so
others,
like
just
so
right
yeah. So
through.
basically, the way it will work is that it's not any different to any other progression system in that you've got the eccentric, isometric methods, whatever, but they alter as the training system progresses in ways that still work on those things but allow you to move bigger loads.
Yeah.
And obviously, like then we're looking at Supra-Maximal loads then closer to the test.
Yes.
The one that we pretty much include all the way through though is loaded stretching.
Okay.
I count that as an isometric method. You could argue it's an eccentric method to a degree, but you are staying still.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, we put that in there as like movement prep for most of our athletes through most of their training.
In the beginning of the training or towards the end?
Yeah, warm up. And
Okay.
then we'll take it because
a lot of the time that's going to be like a high stability demand. So you're better off doing that right at the start
Yeah.
than right at the end.
Yeah, walk me through a couple of movements, like as examples.
So you could do like dumbbell bench press hold, but you're
Yep.
holding like right at the bottom, so you're getting like the stretch on the chest. And then you want to kind of accumulate like 2 to 3 minutes. So you're not going to do that all in one. That's going to be broken up into like, 3 to 4 sets. And that will get better with time. And then if you're managing to do it in one, you need to up the weight that you're doing it with. But it's not going to be heavy.
Yes.
Another one you could do is like a Bulgarian split squat.
Yeah.
Or just a split squat, but like with both your feet elevated. So you're like holding that real stretch position. It really depends on the person and how much they can get into that bottom position and hold, right? So like if you're getting like a good stretch and you can go quite far, you're going to need them to stand on 2 plates. Or say if you're doing it Bulgarian style, you might need to elevate your front foot. But again, you're getting into that stretch position and then holding it, accumulating 2 to 3 minutes. With that one, you probably want to do like 2 minutes per leg, most. Yeah. But again, it's accumulation, so.
Yeah, and the weight's obviously lighter, right?
It's really
so they're
light.
going to breathe through it.
Yeah.
I mean, like split squat, you're doing body weight and stuff.
Yeah, like most of the time you're not
That's a
even
tricky one, though, because that almost becomes too isometric. Because most people won't have the range of motion. Yeah. So then it becomes an ISO, which, I mean, that's a problem there in itself.
Yeah.
Like, there's still
But
the
again,
answer is the same.
Like based on the person, that's like exercise selection. Just
Yeah.
depends on like their mobility to start with. But actually, it's a really good form of improving people's mobility.
Yeah. Well, if
as
they
well.
suck at it, then they need to build it up. And that would be one of the better ways to begin building
So then
it up.
you get mobility, stability, and it's super easy because it's only 2 to 3 minutes at the start, like it's, and it's part of the warm up. So they don't even really think about it. But like, yeah, for a lot of people, it's helpful because they won't go away and then do that mobility work anyway. So you're kind of just building it in like a quick way that's also going to be beneficial to their training.
Yeah.
I mean, I like loaded stretching as opposed to like traditional stretching as well, because I just find it carries over to the movements better, because you're placing load on the tendons and the muscle bellies in a lengthened state for extended period of time, so they get more resilient. And the other thing is it can actually be a really good hypertrophy stimulus, which if you need to sell it to your athlete, that's a great way of doing it. So you're putting the muscle under a high degree of stretch under load, which is a really strong signal for mTOR. So that gives you a lot of anabolic signaling there. And because it has an occlusion effect, because it's under a stretch, you get a partial occlusion, like the blood flow is limited. It becomes very fast twitch dominant, because the fast twitch fibers are anaerobic and the slow twitch aerobic fibers don't have enough oxygen to contribute. So how often do you get to put your fast twitch fibers under tension for 2 to 3 minutes? You don't, because they're fast twitch, right? They get a couple of 5, 6 reps, whatever, and they're done. So you can accumulate a lot of tension and work for your fast twitch fibers in a stretch position then, which ends up being a really powerful hypertrophy stimulus, as well as the fact that because of the occlusion effect, you get a high buildup of lactate, growth factors, and metabolites, which in itself is a hypertrophy stimulus as well. So you're not only getting them more resilient under load at extreme inverted commas joint angles, you're also getting a hypertrophy response to it, which you wouldn't get with a kind of traditional stretching method.
Well, this is also something that's easy to recover from. So is this on all days?
No, we generally just do that on the isometric.
Just the
or
iso,
we might pick one. Say the athlete has 3 that they need to do and put 1 at the beginning of each session.
Yeah.
Or we might put 2 or 3 depending on their requirements then on the isometric day.
Okay.
But we generally also put them first because then it makes sure they do it.
Well, yeah.
Because
I
I mean,
if you put it at the end, most people are
yeah,
going to
they
go,
won't, right? I mean,
that's not important.
loaded stretching is actually a really good training, and that's why it's it's in like DC training and things like that. It's really powerful if you look into it, but people still won't do it.
Yeah, I know.
You can talk to your blue in the face about how great it is, and they'll go, "Okay, I'm going to squat now."
Well, yeah, you have to kind of figure out ways to sneak it in without them knowing what they're actually doing.
Yeah.
And that's another trick.
But the other way you can do it then is also, it's not as effective because you don't get the occlusion effect as well, but you can split it up into smaller bouts.
Yeah.
So you could do like 3 1-minute bouts in between your warm-up sets for whatever the main movement is in the day if you're really struggling to get them to do it. But the problem is because you don't get the same time under tension, the same occlusion effect, the hypertrophy stimulus is not as good. But the mobility advantage, whatever benefits, is probably as good at that point. You don't get all of it then.
Yeah. The way that I would have implemented that out, as well as the way that you're talking about, would be time sets.
Yeah.
So, the bamboo bar with like 1 kettlebell per side, and you just start when the song starts.
Yeah.
And you're holding it. I mean, you're still doing some reps, but every time you need to stop, it's a loaded stretch.
Yeah.
And it's there for 20, 30 seconds, then you do more, and so I'm covering all of it. There's iso holds, there's holds at the top, so it's the whole thing throughout the whole damn time, and the other way that I've used a lot of the loaded stretching is if it's a movement like with my shoulder, it's dicey. So if the shoulder's strong, I can use a dumbbell, I can do a fly, right? Because there's more gravity. Normally it will be a standing the machine fly or a standing cable press. Yeah. And then I'll get into the position, I'll hold, and then I guess you would say it's a form of PNF. Once I get to that position, there's my end range, just slightly push against it for 1 or 2, and then, after about 2 or 3 of those, I was like, there's a good position I can hang out in for a little while. Yeah. And for myself, over the period of the last 6 years, this shit's vital. Yeah. I mean, if I don't, it's a huge difference.
I mean, it's crazy how many people, like, say the typical, like, oh, my knees hurt when I squat. Yeah. You give them like a split squat loaded stretch to do 2 days a week, and then all of a sudden it just magically disappears.
Yeah. I mean, this is shit I wish I would have known, decade ago.
But what you're describing there is basically just the progression system, right? So you've got the regular loaded stretch. So to use your example, the dumbbell press is easy, right? You're just there and you're pulling it down, and that's it. But then you can progress that to like a PNF thing, right? So what we've done before is then you're there and you have a partner just press down, and you have to fight it for 5 seconds, then they let go, and then they press for 5 seconds, and then they let go, and then once you get strong at that, then you can even turn it into almost like not ballistic but like oscillatory. So you're there and then you pull and then you pull. So they might be 10 seconds apart for 3 minutes or whatever, but every time you pull, you're exaggerating that stretch and just trying to get lower. Obviously, again, like we say, you can't just jump into that because your tendons and everything and soft tissues have to be prepared for it. Yes. But if you can get to that point, that's a really powerful mobility tool then that you can do in 2 or 3 minutes that has all those other benefits. Yeah. It kind of ticks every box for you.
All right, so the next day we're getting into the concentric. Yeah. Owen, can you bring my headphones down a little bit? Yeah. For some reason they went way up.
I mean, I guess this is where our programming is just going to be very similar to everywhere else's, right? Because that's what everyone else focuses on most of the time, right? So people really, I mean, concentric contractions is basically what everyone associates with training, right? Yes. But actually, they don't contribute that much. And what I mean by that is like the hypertrophy stimulus is more in the eccentric. Any hypertrophy you get during the concentric is mainly from lactic acid and metabolite buildup like that. The actual muscular damage is pretty much all during the eccentric. So the role in hypertrophy is not that good as people people think. And then likewise, like I referenced those studies earlier, you can get stronger concentrically through just eccentric training.
Yes.
But obviously you have to practice the skill at the end. I'm not saying it's useless. I'm just saying people focus their entirety on it when maybe they shouldn't. Mm-hmm. Now, the fact that the concentric contractions don't really have any muscle damage can mean that you can do more of it, though, which can be really helpful. So when we're saying concentric actions there, we are referring to like methods where you de-emphasize the eccentric if you want to.
Yes.
So for me, the absolute best kind of example of that would be like sled work and loaded carries. Like it's all basically pure concentric. And when you have people who are like, again, early in the accumulation phase, what we're going to call it, they can do huge workloads on that stuff and recover absolutely fine.
Yes.
So I really like it in the earlier stages for that reason. I suppose the other, like we talked about, like eccentric actions tend to give you more hypertrophy toward the distal part of the muscle belly. Concentric contractions tend to give you more hypertrophy around the muscle belly itself rather than towards the distal end where the tendons are. So if you're a bodybuilder and that's important to you, then there's that. But the thing to remember is that concentric contractions are the most energetically expensive because you're actually moving something. Mm-hmm. So in terms of calorie demand, they're actually higher. So actually when we have it from an energy demand, not from a nervous system demand, a workout full of mainly concentric work, sled pushes, loaded carries, or exercises where you de-emphasize the eccentric, then your calorie demand will be higher, which actually sometimes actually needs to be taken into account of when you're programming for people. So when we generally don't do that much of that work when people are in a big calorie deficit for that reason.
Okay.
That makes sense. But conversely,
but couldn't you do that to have a less of a calorie deficit?
Yeah, you could, absolutely. I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
But then the other benefit is because there's so little muscle damage, this is referring mainly to athletes now. When they're in season, we take the eccentric out because there's a lot of muscle damage. It's very neurologically demanding. Concentric dominant work, you can still do loads of in season and recover fine. So they could do things like pin pulls, pin presses, etc., with a de-emphasized eccentric, or even if they got bumper plates and stuff, they're allowed to drop the bar, if you could, and sled work and carries, they can keep that workload really high during the in-season to keep their strength and their muscle mass up without draining their resources too much.
Okay.
So there are benefits to doing concentric dominant work, but like I said, most of the time our programming is going to be quite similar here to what most people would do. I suppose we probably do use some different methods when you get closer to like the closer towards the test, if you like. But the earlier phases, it's going to be volume work. Sub-max volume work, like everyone does, because it works. At the end of the day,
Yeah, it's across all training philosophies. Now, as you get closer to the peak, how would it differ?
So we generally, the method that we probably use most with people is clusters, because they probably are the best training tool for hypertrophy and for strength that exists, in my opinion, at least.
Why?
Because they either allow you to do more workload with the same weight, or they allow you to do more weight for the same workload. Does that make sense?
No.
Okay.
Explain that another way.
So say you're resting 20 to 30 seconds between reps. How many reps can you do at 80% before you gas out?
Yes.
Yeah. How many can you do if you get the rest?
No, I get it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if we're talking hypertrophy, if you want maximally effective reps, which we can cover at some point, so basically you need 80% effort for maximally effective reps. So if there's 80% on the bar, you have it straight away. Rep 1 is effective. So if that's our goal, and we're a powerlifter who still wants to lift heavy, but we want hypertrophy, we can accumulate more maximally effective reps for hypertrophy with 80% on the bar. So there's no wasted reps, but we get more volume at the same workload. Yeah. So then from a hypertrophy point of view, it's more efficient. You don't have to do as many exercises, many sets, whatever. And then when you work when you start peaking more towards strength, again, how many reps can you do at 90% before you gas out? How many can you do if you get 30 to 40 seconds in between? But you still get the same motor recruitment pattern. In fact, a lot of the time it's better, because if you're at 90%, what does rep 3 look like?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. What does rep 3 look like? Like the quality of the work can get better. So that's why I like it so much, for those reasons. It basically it's nothing fancy when you really boil it down. It's just by taking a rest, I can do more quality work at the same load, or I can use more load for the same amount of volume. I mean, it's not fucking rocket science.
No,
right?
no. I mean, I have a strong bias on when you're dealing with heavier weights. Anything over 2 is stupid.
Yeah.
Because you're just reinforcing poor technique.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas with clusters, I mean, I'm not a big fan of like Poliquin's clusters that he kind of used, because I think 15 to 20 seconds is not long enough.
No, I don't think so.
I think if you're a beginner,
I would call that rest pause.
Yeah.
And that's a different bodybuilding type.
Yeah, I think if maybe you're a beginner or like early intermediate and the actual training loads aren't that heavy, then fine. But I mean, it takes me 45 seconds to freaking set up.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So, and the original clusters that were invented by Carl Miller, who was an Olympic lifter, they use rests between 30 and 60 seconds.
Yeah.
And I think that's way more applicable to strength athletes or anyone who's kind of fast twitch dominant or has just developed a good strength base.
Yes.
Because you give someone 15 seconds between 90% reps when they've been training for 3 or 4 years.
Yes.
You may as well. They're probably stronger if they don't.
Well, even if the percentage is just a little bit under what you would call effective repetitions, the accumulated fatigue will get it there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which is when you're dealing with, say a set of 5, maybe the first 2 aren't really effective, but the last 3 are. Yeah. Actually, why don't you talk a little bit on that? Because I may be talking over people's heads.
Yeah, but that's why I like the clusters, just to go, because if you can always start on 80% plus, and then get more reps, there are no wasted reps.
Exactly.
But yeah, so basically the idea of a maximally effective rep is that the idea is that to get a good hypertrophy stimulus, you must recruit all the muscle fibers, which requires give or take about 80% effort. Now, that's different to 80% on the bar. It's 80% of what you're capable of doing at that moment in time. Now, as you get stronger, that can actually come down because your recruitment pattern becomes more efficient. But 80% is like a good ballpark for most people. So that's why, like, you can make the argument that doing sets of 6 to 10 is more efficient than, say, sets of 20 to 30. Because if you're going to get about 5 or 6 maximally effective reps in a set no matter what you do. Because once you get to 80% effort, you're probably going to fatigue at like 2 to 4% per rep, depending on how fast twitch dominant you are. So it's only those last, let's say 6, for just the sake of the argument, that are actually going to be maximally effective. Now, the point is, how many reps do I have to do to get there? So if I'm doing a set of 6 to 10, then I maybe do the first 4, and then the rest of the set is effective. If I do a set of 20, I got to do 14 reps to get there.
Sucks.
It does suck. Now, I'm not saying high reps don't have a place, because they absolutely do. But what I'm saying is, if you're just looking as like a ballpark figure, what rep ranges should I be using hypertrophy? Why do more volume than you have to do to get the same result?
Well, sometimes I think if they really think about it, they're doing less effective reps with more volume.
Yeah.
And because they haven't really thought this through. They're just doing what they do. Yeah. And then I would almost be confident in saying 20% of the shit that they're doing is probably effective.
Yeah, that's probably fair.
And that's might be being
because a lot of people, you're going to see it doing the high rep stuff, because some people almost perceive it as being easier when it really is not. It sucks. But then they tap out. So if it's like a 15 RM, they tap out at 12 because that feels hard.
Yes.
But say the last 6 are effective. If you went to 15, you'd get 6. You stopped at 12 because it started to burn a bit, and who wants to make it hard, right? So you got 3. So you did 12 reps and you got 3 good ones.
Yes.
So you got 3 times the amount of non-effective reps as to good reps. So then you can really start to economize your training way better. So, I mean, most people are going to need between 20 and 30 maximally effective reps for a muscle group to get the most stimulus that they can in a workout, in a session. So then you can start planning your volume straight away. It's like, well, if I have the intensity strict down, so I say, well, so let's say going to failure gets me 6, so I'm going to stop 1 short of failure. So I get 5 per set. Okay, then how many sets do I need? I don't need to do more than 6 actually hard working sets for that muscle group in a workout, and I'm done. Yeah. At least for that session. And I think it was when you had Jay on, when he summed, not in this context, but he summed it up really well. He's like, you can only get as much as you can from a workout, and then you can either go home or you can keep working and get more tired. Yes. It's entirely up to you. Yeah. So then you kind of realize that really the intensity of the set is more important than the volume per se. So like the mechanical tension that you get in the set is more important. There is a minimum threshold. So like you might need 15 maximally effective reps to get any benefit, and then you might need 25 to get maximal benefit. But that's not actually a massive workload if you actually work hard enough.
No.
If you're doing easier sets and you're only getting 2 or 3%, okay, then the workload is high. But if you're getting 5% and you're working harder, then that's fine. And I guess but then you run into the kind of argument like, okay, so why do compound movements then? Because if the goal is maximum mechanical tension to get those maximally effective reps, and that's the main stimulus, why do a compound movement? To which my argument would be, because it may not be maximally effective at recruiting that muscle, but it gets you some effective reps for a lot of muscles. Does that make sense?
It would depend upon the context, though, too, right? If we're just talking pure muscle hypertrophy,
Yes. Yeah.
maybe they're right. Maybe I can understand that argument. But if you're actually talking, strength sports or sport demand, the body doesn't work in isolation.
No, absolutely.
So there's more going on.
Yeah. And the point that I would, even just from a hypertrophy point of view, if we're talking with like average Joe, not pro bodybuilder, let's just take like a back squat.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not gonna 100% maximally recruit any muscle group, but it might recruit your quads at 90% efficiency, and it might recruit your glutes at 70% efficiency. So if you actually looked at how many effective reps you might get, okay, you might not get the 5 per set that you get just for a bicep on a bicep curl, but you might get like 3 for your quads and 2 for your glutes, or 2 for your quads and 2 for your glutes. And so it ends up being efficient because you don't have to do a set for each of those muscle groups.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
So
for
makes
average
sense.
Joe who doesn't have 2 hours to 3 hours to be in the gym, split, you can end up doing less total volume then. So then you have to kind of.
Well, I think that's just from that bodybuilding side. That's something that kind of gets lost too. Like you have effective reps through your lat work for your biceps.
Yeah.
So how much bicep work do you really need if those reps are in the effective range?
Yeah, absolutely.
So sometimes just picking the more compound movements, it's traps are a good one, right? Like just stupid shit. Like if you do this, it's going to side raises. Like don't go too high because you're going to build your fucking traps. Like, okay, I get that. So you might work your traps. Like that's it's a problem. I've seen a lot of people that have overdeveloped traps. We see them every day.
It's crippling.
Right? Every gym you go to, everybody has traps that are too big. It's like too big of a problem. It's like, this is a good thing, because that means you may not have to do direct trap work. Like, who the fuck wants to shrug?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't.
Yeah, totally get you.
So if I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
And I think that gets lost in the hypertrophy world a little bit, because now people will always look at the upper echelons and what are they doing, right? The Mr. Olympias. But the problem becomes if you think about what would a Mr. Olympia competitor have to do in terms of volume to get effective reps on a squat. How much weight can they move on a squat?
Yeah.
It's going to trash them probably from a joint connective tissue. That's why they have to start to move towards the isolate, and that's where body part splits really started to become popular. Was when bodybuilders started to get big and strong enough that whole body training started to beat them up too much. Then they had to go towards body part splits because they could get more workload but with less connective tissue tendon stress. But now everyone else looks at that and thinks I need to do that because that's what they're doing. But it's like, well, you're not going to be doing your sets of 8 to 10 with 550 or 600, are you, on squat? So you probably can do 3 sets of 6 to 10 or 4 sets of 6 to 10 on back squat and not implode. You'll be okay, and it's probably more effective for you from hypertrophy. I'm not saying isolation exercises are useless because they're absolutely not. I'm just saying, as with everything, going to either extreme probably is not optimal for anyone.
Now we broke down, the 3 mechanics of a rep: eccentric, isometric, and concentric, and how you lay those out over a full macro cycle, let's say, in isolation. Right. So now when you're laying those all out, concurrently.
Yes.
You know, how does that piece together, or what factors have to be integrated in your brain as it comes together? For example, in one case, you could have weight releasers used twice in the same week.
Yeah.
You know, once for the isometric and once for the eccentric.
Yeah.
You know, so what are some of the things that you try to look for? Like, is that something that you want to look for, or something that you look to not have happen?
Yeah, we generally try to keep them all in phase with each other.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, because, and this is the thing that like triphasic training is pretty popular, right?
Yes.
And I don't want to criticize that too much. But the thing I don't like about it is that it focuses too much on one type at a time. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, an eccentric, an isometric, and a concentric contraction are different motor tasks. So being good at one does not make you good at the other. Mm-hmm. So if you're always focusing a training block on one, then there's going to be a hole in your ability with the other ones. So if you want to express maximal strength, you've got to be good at all three at the same time. So that's why we do all three in the microcycle, and that's why we also peak them together. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the goal would be that if, you know, it's pretty far in the progression system and weight releases are being used, we would be looking to do them 2 or 3 times a week. Mm-hmm. But if you're used to training whole body 3 times a week with all the methods that have led up to that, generally speaking, that isn't a problem. Mm-hmm. Now, you might need, obviously with individuals, it might vary a little bit either way in terms of the loading or the volume, but it's not, by the time you get there, you are ready for it, if you've programmed it properly. And again, the thing that maybe will go unmissed is that the volume of these things aren't going to be super high. You know, you might be, so if it's the weight releaser work with an overloaded eccentric, we might be doing 2, maybe 3 sets of like 2 to 3, and then you're done. And then you might do that on bench. And if it's a deadlift, then it's not really as appropriate there. Then we might be doing something like a pin pull with a slow eccentric.
And that's not counting the warm-ups leading up to that.
That's not counting the warm-up. That's what it says.
Yes.
So the volume ends up being pretty low.
Yeah.
And again, because you've done all the higher volume of workload, whole body, for the months leading up to it, yes, it's neurologically demanding, but from a muscle perspective, at least, you're not going into Wednesday being super sore from Monday and so on and so forth. So yeah, the goal is to have similar methods in the same loading range being used at all 3 sessions as you go through.
Where do you see people screw it up?
They do too much volume. It's always that. Like we were saying, if you really work, you said about people like just going off and doing extra.
Yeah.
If you do 3 hard sets on a squat variation, a press variation, hinge or a pull variation, like if they're genuinely hard sets, then you're done. That's enough volume. Again, you can do more work, but you'll just get more tired. Mm-hmm. So again, most of our sessions probably don't involve more than 3 or 4 sets in a workout.
Yeah.
And then 3 exercises. And then there might be like 1 or 2 isolation exercises at the
Usually
end.
back work.
Yeah, something like that will usually be on like a cable to
Yeah.
reduce the neurological demands. Or for example, say the 3rd exercise is like a row or a pull, there might be a posterior chain based exercise there on a machine or a cable to just touch base with that.
Yeah.
But because the goal is always not to trash yourself, and the goal is always to have as many good workouts as you can. Mm-hmm. So the volume is adjusted so that you're not going into the next session trash. That's the whole point of it.
Yes.
And in my opinion, you get the best end result by having the greatest number of good sessions. There's always going to be shit sessions.
Oh, yeah.
But the goal is that I would always rather underreach very slightly and make sure the next one's going to be good than overreach slightly and then have a bad one.
We're all in this weird industry, right? To where you have a lot of positioning. So
Yep.
let's say coaches positioning, training philosophy, positioning, and so forth. And one of the criticisms I have of all that is I think people miss out because they're not learning different philosophies to be able to see how much is similar amongst all of them.
Yep.
With those positionings, what would be some of the criticisms other people that would have different philosophies are going to try to punch towards you to say, this is why this
Doesn't work.
Doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
The keyword, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, the most common ones that we get probably is that you can't do whole body 3 days a week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't, apparently. So I was like, well, until like the 50s, that's all people did, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying they were lifting as much, but all the strong people from the 50s and 60s, that was the only way to train.
Yeah.
Because you didn't have a choice. I mean, at that point, most gyms were segregated. So if you're a guy, you train Monday, Wednesday, Friday. If you're a lady, you train Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and that's it. But again, that is usually that, and also like you mentioned earlier about like lack of transfer. But that's generally aimed at like the earlier phases. Do you know what I mean? But that's like taking someone in block 1 of a program and seeing them doing easy bar curls and say, well, how the fuck's that going to be a big bench? It's like, well, it doesn't directly, but that's not the point.
That's actually a pretty shitty criticism, right? Because no matter what the training philosophy is, I can make an argument there's a lack of transfer for any accumulation block to whatever it's going to be in the, peak block.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's usually the recovery element that gets thrown at us the most.
Yeah.
But again, you adapt to it, and it's done incrementally. Like anything will trash you if you jump straight into the fucking deep end. Like if we just jumped into high frequency next week, then yeah, of course we're fucked.
Yeah, of course.
No, but you didn't do the groundwork to get there. And there is a lot of evidence that whole body training is
That's a tricky one though too, right? Because let's say somebody just jumped straight into conjugate and they couldn't handle it. The conjugate people are going to say, well, you're out of fucking shape.
Yeah.
Right. If somebody, if they just jumped into what you were doing and they can't handle it, you can just say the same thing.
Yeah.
You're just not fucking shape. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
No, I get that, but I mean, we're kind of presenting this here as but we're kind of presenting it as a system.
Yes.
Not our only.
Yes. No.
It's what we end
it's
up
just
using
one.
with a lot of people because it tends to bring with it good results, but the main benefit that we found from it is that people get beat up less.
Yes.
Like for our lifters, our rate of injury is super low. I mean, the worst thing we usually have to deal with is a bit of tendinitis.
Yeah.
That's literally it. Like muscle tears and all that strains almost has like disappeared, barring like freak accidents, like shit happens type thing, That was the main thing we got from it. Okay, I genuinely think they are getting stronger than they would be if they were using maybe a more traditional approach, inverted commas. But that's the thing that we like about it, is that they feel better. And when you feel better, you train harder.
Yeah.
The other perspective is it allows you to train the patterns more regularly. Okay, just because it's not a back squat, you're still squatting 3 times a week. So then when it comes to peaking, if you drop your frequency and up the intensity, squatting twice a week is easy.
Yeah.
And that acts as a peak for you. If you're squatting once a week and you go to peak, the only option you have is to reduce the volume of the 1 day a week you squat. Whereas if you squat 3 days a week, you can drop down to 2 and still practice it more regularly, and it still acts as a deload. Or even then, if we look outside powerlifters and look at athletes, if they're accustomed to squatting 3 days a week, they can easily drop to 2 and manage that just fine in season when they've got all those extra demands on them. Because relative to what they're used to, it's not that big of a training stress for them.
Yeah.
So those are the biggest benefits that we've kind of found, is not necessarily that everyone's just, if there was a system that put 50 pounds on everyone's lift in like 3 months, we'd all be doing it, right?
Well, there's no perfect system, right?
Well, so what we're looking at it is more the quality of the work and how the longevity of the lifter.
Yeah.
And how they feel in the process. And this is what we've generally found works well with people, especially people who like to maybe push themselves a bit too much.
Yeah.
Because when you start introducing the tempos and the pauses, let's pretend there's no evidence at all that they're beneficial. It allows that person to push to RPE 9 without loading their body with silly weights at silly points. That's another big benefit to it. So, that again, so I believe it's more effective, but the main reason that we use it is maybe a bit more qualitative than people might think, if you like. And again, it's not the only thing that we use. It's just we wanted to present something that maybe people aren't using and are a bit unfamiliar with, that's all.
No, and that's why I wanted you to present it, because I think that there's another whole global component here of, somebody's personality type to what training's going to fit that. So if there's somebody that thrives in uncertainty, this probably isn't what they're going to want to do, nor is a high frequency. They're going to want probably conjugate type of shit. If they thrive in certainty, they're going to want something that's more laid out entirely. And if that connection isn't part of the whole process, then they're going to not like what they do, and then that brings up that doubt.
Yeah.
And now we're dealing with a mental aspect of all this shit, which kind of goes in there too. But, you know, people listening, I think they need to think about this a lot, because they'll hear this and be like, man, everything I'm doing is wrong, right? Because they're not doing this. Like, if you're making progress, it's right, right? And
absolutely.
if you think it's right, it's probably right.
Yeah.
Because you've convinced yourself it's right. And we've all seen some of the dumbest shit make people really, really strong.
Yeah, if you believe in it.
Yeah, and we sit back like, whoa, like I can't wrap my head around this one. You can wrap your head around most things.
Yeah.
But that person thought it was right. They're not beat up, you know, and they're
But I mean,
forward.
the biggest overarching factor is always effort, right?
Yes.
And effort usually stems from belief and confidence. So but again, that's why I'm not a big fan of just having one system, because I think you do a disservice to people then, because
Yes.
no one system, it's not even that it works for everyone. Not everyone wants to do one system.
Yes.
And I think your job as a coach is, okay, of course you need some kind of underlying principles, otherwise you're just flailing in the wind with whatever, right? But your job as a coach really should be to, as much as possible, give them what's optimal whilst giving them what they enjoy, or at least what they naturally gravitate towards, because otherwise they're just pulling in the wrong direction the whole time. Like you said, the stupidest programs have produced the greatest results when they're done with 100%. So you need to get as close to 100% out of your client, your athlete, as you can, while staying true to what you believe is optimal and scientifically sound.
Yes, and I personally believe that too many coaches get too married to their bias.
Yeah.
Right, and you 100% you should have a bias, right? Because that's going to allow you to grow, because you're going to find holes, fix those holes, and all the other stuff. But you still have to have an understanding of other philosophies, because your job is to help the person that's in front of you.
Yeah.
And maybe your bias, your philosophy isn't that.
Yeah.
And this isn't, once you understand one pretty solid, you can understand all of them.
Yeah.
Right. So, yes, the one answer could be just refer them to somebody that's got a different philosophy. But how do you know they're good?
Yeah.
How do you know they give a fuck? You
And
know,
that's not how you get better either. I'm not saying
Yeah,
that
it's
you.
true.
I'm not saying that you shouldn't have the confidence to say this isn't my field.
Yes.
But like at the end of the day, you are gonna learn stuff from every system you look at.
Yes.
It might be one thing, like you might research conjugate and you have no intention of using it, whatever. But you might look at it and just find one or two things like, okay, that's interesting. I like that. Okay, then you take that away, and you discard what you deem not useful.
Yeah.
But
Well, I think the problem is it's a lot of people become tribal.
Yeah, well, that's the same with human nature. And
Yeah, I mean, this is
right?
my tribe, right? And then they miss out on so much.
Yeah.
You know, that it's always been amazing to me that people will say, well, this don't work, or this is the best. But then you look at how everybody trains globally, and there is no best. There's like a lot of things that work.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, so it's like, okay.
But you've got the secret one.
But yeah, but and some people are like that though, because they'll think, now if everybody just did what I would,
They'd all be so much
they'd all be so
stronger.
much better. I'm like, if that kind of was the case, wouldn't they all be doing it?
Yeah.
Because everybody wants to get better.
Yeah.
You know, everybody's looking for that, you know, holy grail or whatever it is.
I just think coaches don't like to admit they have all the answers, though. So it's like, well, if my way isn't the best, that means that some of my knowledge is suboptimal.
Everybody's knowledge is suboptimal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. But people don't like that sometimes because I don't know, like I find with some coaches, they think that makes them look inferior. Whereas I want someone to turn around to me and go, you know what, as much as I know, there's so much I don't. Like that's the best attitude to have. If your end goal is to give the best service to the people that hire you.
If your end goal is just to become better.
Yeah. If you want to look good on Instagram or whatever, then yes, saying you have all the answers in your system is the best is probably the way to go, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, but in any other context, it's always like, it depends.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's learn more.
Well, there's a big disconnect between those that look great on social media and those that actually make a living doing what they do.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
It's huge, right?
Yeah.
The people that you think make a living doing what they do don't.
Yeah.
You know, they're broke, poor. Then the ones that you really don't even know are actually make a complete 100% full living on what they do.
It's because they're too busy making a living out of
They're
it.
too busy making a living, right? So it's just it's a weird ass thing.
Yeah.
Are there any things that I forgot about this training here? Because I didn't even look at my notes like once.
I mean, we were talking about like the maximally effective reps, and I suppose like the bit we didn't touch on is like the intensification methods.
Yes.
For bodybuilding and stuff, and like
Yeah.
at the end of the day, like a lot of things like supersets and stuff like that, when you really start looking into them, don't actually work that well. And this is the problem with hypertrophy, is that what feels good, it doesn't necessarily mean it works. So I mean, it's what, you know, people like to have a pump and feel the burn up, but like that doesn't correlate to actually the stimulus you're getting from it, right? So people love to do like trisets and circuits and loads of drop sets and all that stuff because it makes them feel like they're achieving the end goal. It makes them feel like they're working hard, but if the currency of hypertrophy is maximally effective reps, is it getting you more? That is the only like kind of measure of it. So like you mentioned rest pause. That's probably my favorite intensification method, because you take a weight that you might do for 6 to 10. And then you get, let's say we go to one side sort of failure. So we get those 5 maximally effective reps for argument's sake. Then you rest like 20 seconds, right? So how many more reps? If you've just done 10 in a rest pause, how many can you get if you rest like 20 seconds?
20 seconds?
Yeah.
7? I mean, 6, 7?
Okay.
You know, it's gonna be, now you take it down a little bit, it's going to get cut
That's
in
fine.
half.
6 is fine.
Yeah.
So if 6 represented failure to you,
Yeah.
and we go back to that, we need 80% effort plus, which is usually means you can get 6 reps.
Yeah.
Your rest pause part of the set was entirely maximally effective, because you could only get to 6, which means you started at roughly 80% effort, right?
Yeah. Now you add me one more rest pause, it's going to go to 3.
Yeah. So you get whatever, you got your 5 or 6 from the initial set.
Yeah.
Then you got another 6, and then you took a short break, and then you get 3.
Yep.
So you got 6, 6, and 3. Okay, well, I just got 15 maximally effective reps in one extended set. That's more than I can get in 2 regular sets. That's like 2.5 sets
Yes.
worth of reps.
No,
there.
that's huge.
That is huge.
That's huge.
Because then, okay, well, I can do 2 of those sets, and I'm done on that muscle group.
Yes.
At least, right?
Sometimes 1 will take care of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's how people need to look. And again, you can take rest pause there and you can fuck that up.
Of course.
Because if the first set is 15, well, then you've done a load of work you didn't need to. If the rest is too long and then you end up getting 12, right? Well, then half of that was useless anyway. You haven't really made it more efficient, have you? Because you did 27 reps and you still only got 12 good ones. Whereas in your example, you got 15. I don't know, maybe you did 21 reps. I can't remember the math. So your proportion of effective reps is really high. That is the measure of, is an intensification method effective?
Yeah.
So that's why I really like rest pauses. I really like drop sets. But again, if they're done right, like if you're getting 10, 12 reps every drop, then you're just wasting energy.
Yeah.
Myo reps, do you know of those?
Tell me what those
Okay,
are.
so-
I'm sure I do under a
So
different name.
I think it's Borges Fragile. I'll probably pronounce that terribly, and I'm sorry. But basically, you do a set at the beginning. Now, in the original, it was 16 to 20, but it can be whatever the fuck you want, realistically. The goal is that it just has to be 1 or 2 reps short of failure. So again, we should be getting those 4 or 5 effective reps just from that bit alone. And then it's basically a rest pause set. Again, it's just dressed up differently. So the goal is that you do micro sets. So you take 5 breaths, it's done in breaths, but you can add time to it if you want, and you do 2. And you take 5 breaths and you do 2.
No, I know
You
what
take
it
5
is.
breaths
Yeah,
and you
yeah,
do 2.
yeah.
You keep going until you can't. And then if you get more than 5, then you need to put the weight up next time. So if you get 6 sets of 2, you probably got 12 maximally effective reps there, because you would have been starting at 80% fatigue, plus whatever you got at the beginning. So say you got 4 at the beginning, you got 12 there, you got 16 in one extended set. Very similar to what you got on the double rest pause.
I've seen different variations. Of
Yeah,
that
and
thing,
again,
yeah.
all this shit is the same thing, but with a different name.
No,
Just
no,
dressed up
that's a weird one, or it's a funny one, because I've seen it where you have to do stretching in between.
Yep,
I've
works
seen
too.
it to where you have to drink water, a sip of water in between.
Yeah.
I've seen all kinds of variants of the exact same thing, just somebody trying to put their signature on it by saying do this, in between.
Exactly, and that's why I like cluster reps, because if you can do 80% plus for more reps, all the reps are maximally effective all the way through. So if, rather than doing my 3 sets of 5 on squat, I get 3 sets of 8. I get an extra 3 effective reps per per set at the same weight. So I get 9 extra reps at the end.
Yeah, one of the principles that I show people during the train your ass off for this same exact thing is taking a unilateral exercise like cross body tricep extensions, and first set getting 10, 12, 15, couple reps shy of failure, and then go straight to the other arm and go back, do a triple set. So it'll go like 15, and then go 10, then go 5, right? Done.
Yeah.
You're good. That's it. One set, good. Well, one set to figure out how much weight to use.
Yeah.
Right, but I call those triple sets. To the double sets, would be another one like standing leg curl, hit one leg, do the other leg, hit one leg, do the other leg, done.
Yeah.
Right, and you get more out of that in a shorter period of time.
Yeah.
And for a lot of powerlifters, they're either going to half-ass whatever this back end crap is.
Yeah.
They're not going to do it, or they're going to do way more of it than they need to, like 4 to 5 sets of 10, which is fucking ridiculous, right? Where you need one, one double set. Yeah, if you do it right, then you're in and out, and you don't have to skip it, and again, it's going to depend upon the training philosophy. If it's a high frequency and it's very heavy front loaded, you got to figure out how to make it just one.
Because you can't be doing that every day.
You can't be doing all that other shit when this is so front loaded with everything else. You just can't.
No. I mean, the other one I like, and again, it's the same principle dressed up differently, which I find tends to work better with strength athletes because they like lifting more, is like mechanical drop sets. So you might go like JM press into close grip press into regular press. And again, with the same principle, like you get that short rest in between, and you go, and again, the way you fuck that up is if you need just a small variation in strength. So a better example might be like incline dumbbell, flat dumbbell, decline dumbbell. Because again, if the strength level in each variation is too different, you go like, okay, I get 10 on my JM press, I take 20 seconds, I go to my close grip and I get 20, it's like, well, that's a waste of fucking time. You're not being efficient. Whereas if it's something like an incline dumbbell, flat, decline, you might get like 10, 5, 4. Then you're working efficiently. But I like them because it tends to people who train for strength tend to like that more. As in it feels more like strength lifting to them, if that makes sense. But again, it's the same, like how do I get more effective reps in less time?
Yes.
And really it is just time. Really, because I mean you could dress it up that you could just do all straight sets if you want to, it will just take longer.
Yes.
The other downside would be you'd also have more garbage reps. Which I'm not a fan of, because why do more work than you have to? It's just more shit you have to recover from with no extra benefit.
Well, I think that the bigger risk there is it just won't get done.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
The last things in a program are usually the things people are going to say, fuck it, I can't. There's always a reason.
Yeah.
Like everybody's serious until it comes down to doing the last things.
And the stuff they don't want to do.
They got to go or whatever. And it's boring. There's a lot of factors that kind of play into it, or they just don't want to do it. Or, I mean, there's the other scenario where they like doing all that shit more than the other stuff. Yeah. And then so there's overemphasis there, where my pushback on that is, well, then just quit doing the other stuff and just do bodybuilding training.
Yeah, absolutely.
Forget this, right? Because then you'll get more out of what your actual goal is, the muscle hypertrophy part. Yeah. And then all this other stuff that's really not suiting a purpose.
But again, that's why we like to put like the loaded stretching at the beginning, because it's like, well, now you'll do it. Yeah. Because you can't move on to squat or whatever until you've done it. Yeah. And it, at first it'll actually hinder their performance, but at least it fucking gets done. It's going to keep them healthier. Yes. Whereas, if you put it at the end, it's like, oh no, man, I forgot I left something in the oven or some bullshit like that or whatever.
Are there any other things that I miss?
That's a good question. I mean, we didn't talk much about, there's a couple of concentric methods that we didn't cover. Like bands and chains, for example. Power training, blood flow restriction training.
Yeah, the blood flow restriction, for sure. The bands and chains, for sure. So let's go through those.
So I mean, one of my favorite concentric methods, especially at the moment, is progressive range of motion, which you see me do. Yeah. So, I mean, Paul Anderson basically invented this. So basically, you take the weight that you want to hit at the end of your training cycle, and then you take it through a slightly greater range of motion as your training cycle goes on. Yeah. So say you got like a 12-week train. Really, the longer the training cycle is, the more effective it is, because the increments that you go through are smaller. So basically, you might put like say 10 to 30 pounds over your PR, depending on the lift, on the bar, and then the first week one is like move an inch or two at most. That's it. And you might end up getting like 15, 20 reps, whatever it is. And well, generally, it depends how often they're doing it. But if they're doing it once a week because they've got like a, they just have a deadlift day, they'll do 3 AMRAPs for that. If they're doing, say, 2 workouts like that a week, so sometimes we have it where they do range of motion training on Monday and Friday, and they would do it for 2 or 3 lifts within that workout. Then they would do, say, 2 sets, or they do 2 sets on the Monday, and then they do 1 set on the Friday, but the goal is beat your best set from the Monday. And so they're still getting 3 sets across the week, but it's split up a little bit differently. And then as the weeks go on, the goal is just drop it down a ½ inch every week until eventually then you're pulling from the floor. The only thing that you need to do with that is as you get to the very bottom, obviously the reps drop as you go through.
Yes, of course.
But the goal is that you get habituated to the load. From a mental point of view, you get used to handling it. You get a lot of volume of work in with a heavy load. I mean, I think partials have almost been kind of like thrown in the bin in a lot of people's head, but they have a big role to play because it's just take week 1. Let's say you get 20 reps on your block pull, you move in 2 inches, but you add up the range of motion and the time under tension for those 20 reps in that 1 set. That's significant. It's probably the equivalent of doing a set of 4 maybe on the full range, which people would argue is significant, right? But it's just because it's done over a short range, people assume it doesn't carry over. But in terms of the nervous system adaptations, desensitizing the Golgi tendon organs, building tendon strength, and again, just from a mental aspect, habituating to the load, all that time under the load is really significant.
Well, there's another factor too that it's fucking fun.
Yeah, it is. And again, especially if you like to lift heavy all the time, right? Yeah. It allows you to lift heavy pretty much every week.
Yes.
In a controlled, periodized manner that leads to a good outcome.
Yeah.
And then basically the only thing we adjust is as the weeks go on and the reps get in greater range of motion, we might drop the volume down just a bit. So take, for example, when you get on the deadlift, when you get below the knee, shit suddenly gets really hard. So it might be like a week or 2 after we drop below the knee, we'll go from 3 sets to 2, just because it becomes so much more demanding. And then the last week before you do the full lift, we'll just do 1. Because again, you are pretty much doing it for the full range then. And that's where you know if you fucked up.
Yeah.
If you pulled 2 reps off like a 2-board, like a mat, 2-inch mat or whatever, you've done it right. Yeah. Then you're in line to hit your PB, right?
Well, a careful consideration with that, though, that I think some people will miss is you have to make sure that you're still using your technique.
Yeah.
You're not using your board press technique or so forth.
That's it. Yeah. So you can't start hitching it just because it's above your knee.
Yes.
It has to mimic, which is why it's a good method for people who've been lifting a longer time.
Yeah.
Or that at least are being watched very carefully.
Well, and because that technique is already ingrained, so like if they've been lifting longer.
Yeah. So then, however you do the movement. So if you're gonna, which I don't like, but if you're gonna bounce off the boxes, then you do it all the way through. If you're gonna board press and you let it sink, you let them all sink. If you're gonna, because what will happen is, I'll say on a board they'll be static, and then it gets to a point where, well, that's a different you just kind of put a different stretch reflex in there. You changed a lot, but you broke a PR.
It doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
But the only downside with that system really is if you overload it, it completely fucks you. So if you get greedy, you get the opposite. Your body actually, it's almost like a fight or flight response.
So how many reps should be on the first iteration, I guess?
Yeah, really in week 1, most people will be getting like 15 plus.
Okay, all right.
If you're not getting that, you probably overloaded it. Or you're one of those rare people who's weak at the top. If that is you, then it's going to be different. And actually, I haven't experimented with it a lot, but this actually has good potential for like equipped lifters, because as you go through the range of motion, the equipment helps you more. So as the lift in theory gets harder, if you're a raw lifter, the reps tend not to tail off as much if you can do it well. So like you see me doing on the boards for bench, it tends to actually work better potentially for equipped lifting than it does for raw, but it does carry over really well for raw. The only thing that you need to take into consideration is if you're doing that, you still have to train the bottom range. So you don't get to the end of that cycle and be like, oh shit, I haven't pulled from the floor for 12 weeks.
Yeah.
You either need to do the full lift, and again, in some kind of like, whether it could be speed work or technical work really, or I actually prefer to do lifts that use an exaggerated range of motion. So it could be like a deficit pull, or something like a front squat rather than a back squat, where you can go into even more knee flexion.
Yeah.
Because you're not only training the full range, you're going even further and keeping your nervous system used to going into that range. If you don't do that, you get to the end of it and you're fucked. You have to keep some kind of end range motion work in there.
Yeah.
Outside of that, we were going to mention like bands and chains. This will probably be controversial, I guess, but like, I don't think they're as useful for raw lifters as they are for equipped lifters and for athletes. And I think a lot of the time they're useful for reasons that people maybe don't get, or they think they're useful for different reasons, if that makes sense.
Yeah, why so?
So, I mean, if you look at like, why would chains and bands be helpful? From one perspective, you can say that, okay, well, they help even out the strength curve in that they make the lift more difficult throughout the entire range of motion, whereas normally where you'd get a mechanical advantage and the weight is lighter, it's adding load on. If you're doing speed work, it can mean that you can accelerate for longer, right? Because normally if you're doing speed work with a straight rod, you have to catch yourself, right? Because otherwise you end up jarring something. So those are the potential benefits. And also if you're using them as an overload tool, they can be useful for that. But like if you think about the drawbacks, if you're a raw lifter, where is your weak point going to be 90% of the time? It's probably going to be at the stretched or the bottom position. So you're overloading the position where you're not weakest. So you're not really you're not exaggerating the weak point there. And the thing that I've seen a lot of the time, if you get raw lifters doing a lot of band and chain work, is they start to get a confusion effect where they get too used to the reverse strength curve. So they get used to the weight being heavier at the top than it is at the bottom. And then when they come to lift regular raw, where actually it's reversed, the lift is hardest at the bottom compared to the top, then it actually hurts their performance there. So if you use them for too long, they can have a kind of confusion effect on the motor patterning, if you like, and make them weak in the bottom end of the range. But I think when people end up getting benefits from them, it's usually because they use them for kind of speed work, and what they do is get more technically proficient. So like you said, like if you're doing 13 sets of 2 of the minutes reps, it's basically an extended cluster set.
Yeah.
And they're usually focusing on good technique because, I mean, it's 60%. So they can, and they get more technically proficient. And then the other kind of like weird bit that you tend to see then is that people often don't get more explosive at the top. They actually get more explosive at the bottom. And then and they use the extra momentum to beat the chains or the bands. So they're not actually necessarily getting more explosive at the bit where the bands are doing anything, if that makes sense. So in that application, they can be useful if you're a raw lifter, because if that is how it's happening, as in you're getting more explosive out the bottom to beat the band, then that is helpful if you're a raw lifter, because that's where you're weak. But people people aren't doing it for that reason, if you understand, or people don't perceive it as that's what's happening. You know? So I think they can be helpful in that regard, but not for the reason that people think, if you like. I do like them if you have really explosive lifters, for getting them a bit quicker, because especially if we're close to a meet, because their default setting is beat the sticking point by being fast. So if you can get them faster, they will be better at their default setting. Does that make? If you've got a lifter who's a grinder, and we all know what we mean, right? Like some people move 60% like they move 90 and whatever, then I don't really see the benefit, because they're never going to be fast. If they're looking at maximizing their strength close to meet, they need to, if anything, get better at grinding out reps. Where you could, if you place the chains in the right place, you could argue they could be used there, but then it wouldn't be speed work, if you know what I mean. So that's how I see them being used, and we end up using them more with like athletes for like overspeed work and assisted jumps and things like overspeed jumps and things like that than we do with lifters.
There's a couple other things that I see as benefits, and this is from when I was training Gen Pop people and just high school kids as well. And it's not for the reasons that people will say. You know, it's the two hardest things to teach people are the ability to get tight before they squat down, and with the bench.
Yeah.
You know, so I can make the argument that a lot of people miss the bench at the bottom because they're not in a good position to press out of the bottom.
Yep.
Because they didn't start right. You know, so the squat's a better example to kind of think this through. If you put not a lot of band, but just a little bit of band on, say a mini band or micro mini band on a Gen Pop person, and you ask them to walk the weight out, they're immediately getting tight.
Yeah.
Their abs are tight, their back's tight, their hips are tight, their feet are rooted.
Yeah.
And you didn't have to say anything.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So that's the one thing. It's same with the bench. You have a little bit on there, and they just can't figure out how to let the weight ground.
Yeah.
We'll put a band on there, and it forces, you know, that to ground. And then it's just a matter of rib cage up, you know, to be able to connect those dots. And so it's a hack.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Because the trick then is, can they do the hack without the band?
Yeah.
Right? There's a transference.
Yeah.
The other thing that's very hard to teach that same population is to stand up in a squat with intent.
Yeah.
Put a band on there.
Yeah,
You know, make
okay.
them sit down.
Yeah.
You know, sit down on a box and just stand up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Put enough band on there, they're going to realize I can't start slow.
Yeah.
You know,
No, you're right.
I have to apply force.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of what I was saying. Like, they learn to beat the band early rather than fight it late, if that makes
Yeah, so
absolutely.
they're I see them as different tools for different means.
Yeah.
that's fair.
You know, and the chains don't do what I just said.
No, absolutely right.
You know, with that. So the chains become a little bit different stimulus in my brain that, yes, it's kind of that filling that overload thing, but sometimes you need a way more chain than people think, you know, to be able to fit that. That one really comes more in because they make noise and it sounds cool. So if it's a beginner or an intermediate, they're going to really, really like to do it.
Yeah.
You know, which changes it
Yeah.
to a certain degree.
No,
But it's, you know, I don't disagree that in some realms the overemphasis is quite high.
Yeah.
You know,
And
quite
it's not even that I'm saying they don't work. It's that I think they, like you're alluding to there, they work for the reasons that aren't talked about.
Exactly. And I would 100% agree with that the reasons that they're being pushed about the most are doubtful.
Yeah.
You know, and
That's
it's,
fair.
you know, I mean, I don't want to say with absolute, right? Because the studies that have been done are kind of shitty.
Yeah, that's
you know,
very fair.
so it's a tough, but the studies that have been done are also supporting kind of what we're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
yeah.
so it is that. Then there's the mental side. So then it's how can it fit?
Yeah.
You know, now when we start talking, you know, reverse band, you know, then to me that becomes a different conversation. If you have, you know, hip replacements and you want to lower the,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
now that's a rehab.
Yeah,
I guess.
absolutely.
That's a different setting. Now, would that work if somebody were not hip replacement?
Yeah.
No, because there's other negatives too that we kind of talked about earlier, that in some cases it provides 2 more legs.
Yeah.
You know, so now you have more stability.
Yeah.
Where they're off, and now guess what? Stability's away.
Yeah.
One way that I purposely cheat, you know, if it's a spider bar, the bars I do use, the bars that have more movement at the bottom,
Pulls them down.
yeah, well, one way to hack that is drop a chain on it.
Yeah.
Now it's not going to swing. Now it just became easier. It's on rails.
Yeah, yeah.
Bing.
Yeah,
There,
absolutely.
Right? So it works.
It has they have like side benefits, which I think are more important than what gets done.
Yeah,
It's the same with like the releases on the Supra-Max work. It's like overloading the eccentric is really useful and it gets people strong really fast. Do you know what? Also, having 20 kilos hanging each side does really well. Makes your bar path really good, really fast.
Well, it swings a little bit. So you got to get tighter.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
got to focus
You got to
more.
stabilize, and if you pitch an inch forward or an inch back, it starts swinging even more, and it gives you immediate feedback if you fuck up, and you learn really quick.
Yeah.
So again, you know, the eccentric overload is important, but maybe that is playing just as much of a role in their benefit as the
It is.
actual
You know,
loading.
I like to look at those things and think, what if this doesn't work for the reason it's supposed to? Then
Absolutely.
why else would it work?
Yeah.
And then you start going down those rabbit holes.
Yeah,
You know, those are the things I like to go down and see because it's more critically thought about. And then sometimes those will lead to a completely different thing.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, if this is only doing what I'm saying, helping them get tight, is there a better way to do this? right? Because this may not be the best way to do that. And if the problem is just not being tight, then maybe the cueing's off.
Yeah.
You know, from the very beginning.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
and that's just a Band-Aid we're putting over it.
It isn't everything.
Yeah.
You know, so you're trying, so you got to dig a little deeper with that, which is, I love talking about that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of talked about speed work like that, right? Like, did you get better with your 15 sets of 2 for 8 weeks because you got faster, or did you just do loads of good technical work?
Or is it just a big cluster?
Yeah.
You know, so then you get more.
Just accumulating more work.
Well, you get more reps that are in the range that you really want.
Or did you just learn to actually fucking go for a rep?
Yeah.
You know, because you had to, because the bands are on there or whatever. Like, you just, you learned intent.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, does it really work the way you think it works? Probably not most of the time.
Yeah, most of the time, right? Because it's, you know, if it's, let's say it's speed work and it's programmed at 60, 65%, whatever it's going to be, is it really that if you're resting 1 minute and you've already 3 reps in?
No.
So now it's already got to that effective rep range, right? So could there be more weight, less sets?
Yeah.
You know, these are the things that kind of go through my head.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and how's that kind of play into this? And what's the conditioning? You know, what's the purpose? Yeah. You know, if it's aerobic conditioning, then why take a minute? You know,
why not take 30 seconds?
Take 30 seconds and just kill yourself.
Yeah.
It is. It's
awful.
Fuck that. No, I mean, it's just different things that kind of play into the same thing, where it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and see. And usually it's when you try to poke holes in your own stuff.
Yeah, because you start questioning your assumptions, and then you're like, oh shit, maybe this isn't what I thought it was.
I think it's good though. I think it's good for everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, because then it broadens it. You know, as long as you still can make a decision.
Yeah, you're not second guessing everything.
Yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, it still works.
Well, you still have
just trying to figure out
you still have
why.
to do it, right?
Yeah.
You can't change your mind every week. You know, and that becomes another thing that you see a lot. You know, is they'll read something and be like, oh, this is wrong, so I'm going to change it. You know, you can learn and watch and see all these different variables playing out, but you still have to execute, and you still have to decide what the fuck you're going to do.
I mean, pretty much everything works, but pretty much nothing works in 2 weeks.
Exactly.
So you got to give it.
Yeah. But if you're changing your mind every 2 weeks because you didn't decide, to me, if you're going to decide to use a training philosophy for X number of blocks, then you decide that. And if you think you're going to question it, fucking log off of everything online. Don't read anything. You know, ignore it and just stay in it. Now you can make notes and think, you know, see all these different things, write them down to do after this is done. You know, run this.
Yeah, because I mean, the second you, like we said about like commitment and hard work, belief, the second you start questioning it, if your work ethic drops, it's kind of, at that point it's like it is destined to fail anyway. Even if it does work, because you've clocked out of it partially. Yeah. Then it's just basically you're proving your own assumption then, aren't you?
Yes.
Basically.
Yeah, so it becomes a huge...
It's like, I want to be right. I want to know that this doesn't work. Almost.
In a way. I mean, I'm definitely that way. I mean, I know what I'm going to personally do, but then it comes to when you start helping other people. It's like, okay, what is their goal? What is their objective? Does it really matter how we get them there? We just need to get them there. You know,
but I mean, that's why... If people ever ask like me what I'm doing in my training, like, do not look at what I'm fucking doing. I'm a guinea pig at best. And I'm all, you know what I mean? Like, that's irrelevant. And also, why is that relevant to you?
Exactly.
It's not. All you're going to do is hope that I have some cool methods in there that you want to try, right? No.
I'm just hanging for a thread that's going to fucking break. So don't watch what I do.
Exactly. I'm here making all the mistakes so that you don't have to, basically. That's my job.
Yes. But then with other people, it's like, okay, zone in, focus. And then if you think other people can be of value, then push those other people in front of them. You know, it's weird, you know, how a lot of people are. You know, don't listen to them, don't listen to them. If I listen to everybody, you know, and if it helps, you know. Then,
absolutely. Totally agree.
Without steering away from the plan.
But I mean, you can learn without questioning yourself.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I hope.
Yeah. Well, you should. You should. I mean, what I would say is, if you can, then you don't really believe in the stuff you believe in.
Then are you really learning?
Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Absolutely.
All right. Was there anything else?
The only ones we got written down is basically blood flow restriction.
Yeah. Let's hit that.
So we really like to use this again for hypertrophy work, just because it's so time effective. So, like we talked about with the loaded stretching, you get an occlusion effect, obviously, when you do blood flow restriction. So because there's no oxygen, you can't use muscle fibers that use oxygen, obviously. So your slow twitch fibers are out straight away. So you have to use fast twitch fibers. But you can do a pretty high rep workload with blood flow restriction. So you're forcing your fast twitch fibers into a position where they have to do a higher number of reps than they would normally do. Because, say we're doing a set of 20, normally the fast twitch fibers would start kicking in, like we said, at that maximally effective range of like 80% effort. So after rep 14, 13, whatever, that's when they start to come into play. If you take the slow twitch fibers out through blood flow restriction, then from rep 1, you get fast twitch recruitment. Might not be full at first, but you're going to hit that maximally effective range way earlier. And then you can also do more reps because the load is lower. So if you do blood flow restriction, you do a set of 20, you might actually get like 14, 15 effective reps.
Now, how do you determine how much blood flow needs to be restricted?
Well, I would say that if you can't get through like a set that's a minute, it's too much.
All right.
Because generally most of the protocols that will get used will be in the slightly higher rep range. Obviously, the problem you can run into is some people have a crazy pain tolerance.
Well, I've seen protocols that are relying on blood pressure cuffs and stuff like
That's
that.
fair.
So
Yeah.
that's why I'm asking, because that becomes this, oh shit, what is this?
Yeah,
I don't want to clot out and die.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, in most circumstances, unless you're talking with people who just have ridiculous pain tolerance, it should be pretty uncomfortable at the start.
Yeah.
So like reps 4 and 5 should be uncomfortable, and then it gets bad when you get to the upper. If you start on rep 1 and like by rep 5 it hurts because just because of the pressure of the cuff alone is digging in, and the blood flow's cut off so much, then you're doing it wrong, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because you get into the point where there's probably just going to be a lot of muscle actual damage from the constriction.
Yes.
As well, and obviously you run into the health risks. So you want like partial perfusion, but not enough so that the slow twitch fibers can do a large proportion of the work.
Yeah.
So again, what we generally will say is, if you take a weight that you could do for like 30 reps, if you can't get to like 15 to 20, because generally we use like 15 to 20 for our blood flow restriction work. If you can't get to 15 to 20 reps with a weight that you can normally do 30 reps with, it's too tight. And then what we generally do is rest pause it for like two times. Like it might be 20 seconds. The lactate builds up, and then you go in and you get effective reps, because by that point the lactate's so high and there's so little oxygen, you get maximally effective reps from the start. Like we said, you do 2 drop sets and then we'll be done. Because again, if you're doing that set of 20, and let's be conservative and say you get 10 effective, and then you get, I don't know, 6 and then 6, you got 22, you're done.
Yeah. So one
most
set.
people, yeah. So we'll just do one set that's really hard, and then it's done. But like I say, if you can't get 15 to 20 with someone you could get 30 with, it's too tight.
Yes.
And then likewise, if you can get up to 30, 25, 30, that's probably not doing anything.
Now, what type of movements are we talking about here? Are you talking about squatting, or are you talking about leg extensions?
Yeah,
isolation?
so we only do it.
Isolation.
Yeah, we only do it for isolation. So it's basically arm and isolated leg work.
Yes.
That's all we use it for.
Okay.
I don't see the benefit of it with things like squats as much, to be honest with you. And just from a safety and motor control perspective,
yeah.
I think the risks way outfar the benefit, especially when realistically you could do your set of squats with blood flow restriction cuffs on, or you could do one set of leg extensions and one set of leg curls and get the exact same thing, or maybe greater because it's more targeted.
Yes.
Like to me, on compound movements, for me, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Especially from a risk perspective.
So it's just taking that same thing we were talking about earlier and how to get less or get more out of the least amount possible.
Exactly. Like, so, I mean, obviously it only really works for direct arm and leg work, but you can do one BFR set and be done.
Yeah.
So if you've got people that need hypertrophy work, and again, it's at the end, what are they going to do? And again, it's got, like you said with the chains, it's got usually a bit of a novelty factor, like people are a bit more kind of encouraged to do it, even if it burns and hurts like hell. But it
a big fucking vein in their bicep
yeah,
I never saw before.
Yeah,
right?
exactly, right? It's quirky, it's different, it makes you look real pumped, so it must be great. I really like that as a method for just, again, it's all about just getting the most out of the least.
Yeah.
For me, especially when it comes to hypertrophy work, if you're training people who primarily their goal is strength. Why, if you need to spend 20 sets on hypertrophy work, or you can spend 5 sets on hypertrophy work, spend 5 so you've got more resources to do the strength work.
Yeah. I mean, that's easy for us to say coming from the strength world. I'm sure there's bodybuilders that are losing their brains right now.
No, I'm sure. But again, if you said to them, well, what if you do one BFR set and it equaled 2 or 3 regular sets, would you take that? I mean, they should say yes. And again, otherwise, do they just like training, or do they like results?
Exactly. Yes. Yes. That might be. I think because I just looked through as we were talking before this, the Supra-Max static dynamic.
I think that's
I think we
much
covered it all.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, guys, we're gonna shut this one down. Tom and Naomi are gonna be here for a while, a few months. So we may sit down and do this again.
Sure.
Hit some other things. If you guys like this, leave comments. Let us know. Leave a review. Do all the other things you're supposed to do, and we're done.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.